Chapter 767. Hunchback Old Man and the others flew out of Wu Tuo Mountain and stopped on top of the towering giant wall. Big brother, are we really going to be manipulated by that kid? He is using us as pawns. I'm so angry. The burly man gritted his teeth in anger. The graceful woman glanced at him, then looked at the hunchbacked old man and said, "Big brother, this brat probably doesn't know the use of the divine coffin. It seems like he wasn't lying. He wants to use us to remove the obstacles and ascend to the throne himself. What a greedy man! He wouldn't have let us take away the divine coffin so easily if he knew about it. The wall will be destroyed sooner or later without the god's corpse." The fat man scratched his belly and said, "But we can't rule out the possibility that he knew about it but pretended not to know. In this case, he might not let us leave. It might be a trap. Even if we help him get rid of those bastards, he might not give Little Seven to us. Without Little Seven, we will all die when we cross the barren area. You might be the only one who might survive, but we will all die." Hunchback Old Man narrowed his eyes. He wants to use us? He's overestimating himself. Little Three, you stay here and monitor this person. The 5 of us will go to the inner wall to avenge 9th and 10th brother. The graceful woman sighed. It's a pity that 9th brother is dead. Otherwise he would be the best person to track us. I'm only good at perception. I'm not as good as 9th brother in disguise. I hope they don't have any perception masters. Did you sense anyone else in the temple earlier? Fatty asked. No. The graceful woman shook her head. He was alone. I sensed Shao Qi's aura and the smell of his blood. Although it has been eliminated, but Shao Qi should have fallen into his hands. Moreover, his injuries aren't light. It's difficult for him to capture Shao Qi with his strength. He should be just an errand boy. There must be someone behind him. Fatty pondered for a moment and looked at the old man. "Big brother, it would be better for me and third sister to stay here. We can take care of each other. Even if something happens, we can escape. 4 of you should be enough. Big brother, don't fight if there is a ruler-level master." "I know." Hunchback Old Man nodded. "You should stay. Big brother, it's not convenient to carry this divine coffin around. Let's abandon the coffin and retrieve the corpse." The graceful woman's gaze landed on the silver divine coffin at the side and she said, "Speaking of which, we haven't seen the protector of this divine wall yet." The stooped old man's eyes flickered, and he nodded in agreement. He walked to the side of the divine casket and searched for a moment before he found a spot. He raised his hand, and with a click, a gust of cold air spread out from the divine casket like frost. The stooped old man's expression suddenly changed. He covered his mouth and retreated, saying, "There's poison, disperse." When the others heard this, they hurriedly retreated, but the handsome 6th brother was the closest and couldn't dodge in time. The white frost landed on his face, causing him to cry out in pain. The fatty beside him grabbed him with one hand and threw him dozens of meters away, smashing him onto the ground. The others hurried over and immediately saw that old 6's cheeks had been corroded by an unknown liquid. White smoke was rising from it, and his face had already festered. Moreover, the festered face was still emitting hot bubbles, gurgling like magma. Everyone was shocked, and the fatty hurriedly lifted him up. He pressed his hand on his head and stuffed him into his stomach. After a while, the fatty pushed old 6 out. Old 6's cheeks were already a mess, and his facial features were like melted wax. His skin and flesh were drooping on his face, and he looked so ugly that no one could look at him directly. The fatty gasped for breath, and a trace of pain could be seen on his face as he gritted his teeth. "Old 2, are you okay?" the stooped old man hurriedly asked. The fatty shook his head slightly, and said while clutching his stomach, "It's a little severe, I need to rest for a while. These damned bastards F***ck. The burly man's face was full of anger, and he clenched his fists tightly. The graceful woman looked at the trembling old 6 and asked, "Are you feeling better?" Old 6's body was trembling in pain, and he couldn't stop trembling. The stooped old man looked at him, and seeing that he was fine, he heaved a sigh of relief. He turned his head to look at the divine casket in the distance, and his expression immediately changed. He saw a swarm of black insects rushing out from the cracks of the divine casket, and they were rapidly spreading toward them. "It's a poisonous insect," the graceful woman also noticed, and she hurriedly warned. "Let me!" The burly man roared, and he swung his broadsword, and took the initiative to rush forward. His broadsword swept horizontally, and the poisonous insects on the ground were flung to the bottom of the giant wall, and some of them were smashed to death on the spot. The others immediately rushed forward to help, and in the blink of an eye, the flood of black poisonous insects was quickly swept away, and the ground was littered with the poisonous insects' corpses and dark green blood, which emitted a horrible stench. The stench made people dizzy, but fortunately they were all physically strong, and they could withstand the poisonous gas as long as they weren't directly infected. The stooped old man lifted his leg, and with a bang, the lid of the divine casket flew off, and fell to the ground with a clang. A large amount of white cold air gushed out from inside and spread out. The few people quickly retreated. Among them, the one who liked to shake his shoulders while talking, a pair of huge wings extended from his back, and they looked like terrifying bats. The wings flapped quickly, and the cold fog was blown away, and the bottom of the divine casket was revealed. The stooped old man cautiously approached, and when he looked down, he saw that the divine casket was empty, and there was no corpse of the immortal. His face became gloomy, and his fingers cracked, and his face was filled with a cold, murderous aura. "It's fake." The other people also saw the situation inside the divine casket, and they immediately became angry. They had sacrificed 3 people, and Shao Qi had gone missing. In the end, the divine casket that they had obtained with great difficulty turned out to be a fake. Moreover, the 6th brother had almost lost his life. F***ck. The burly man chopped the ground with his broadsword, and a small cut was left on the giant wall. "We actually carried a coffin full of poisonous insects around. If I had known this earlier, I would have opened the divine casket back then." The graceful woman was angry, but also powerless. Originally, she came here with full confidence, and especially after she understood the situation of the divine wall, she became even more confident, but she didn't expect that she would suffer setbacks one after another in the blink of an eye. She suddenly felt very regretful. If she had known this earlier, she would have been more careful. She would have investigated this place for a period of time to ensure that nothing went wrong, and then she would have changed from robbing to stealing. That way there wouldn't have been any sacrifices, and they would have been able to find the real divine casket and leave safely. "Big brother, let's go back and kill them all." The burly man's face was filled with anger, and he said to the stooped old man. The stooped old man's eyes were gloomy, and he stared at the empty divine casket in silence. After a long time, he slowly said, "We need to change our strategy." Chapter 768. Let's see their performance. Temple. Dean answered Riley's question. He got up and put on the splitting armor which was made from the hardest bones of the great splitter's body. He walked out of the temple. Riley pondered for a moment. "Master, won't Noise expose our second base if we let him come over? If they send someone to follow you?" Dean looked at him. "It's a good idea. But it doesn't matter if the second base is exposed. They won't dare to act rashly if the person they want isn't there." Although the second base was hidden, but he knew that it would be easy for them to find it if they wanted to. Moreover, he was happy to let them know the location. "You stay and hand over to Noise." "Yes, master. Be careful on the way." The wings on Dean's back stretched out from the gap of the armor. He flapped his wings and flew in the direction of the sighing wall. It didn't take long for Dean to arrive at the inner wall. He found the central base of the intelligence network. It was located on the edge of the city under the protection of the Earl. The intelligence personnel immediately recognized him. Master, Dragon Clan and Rock Clan have rejected our invitation. The Wing Clan hasn't received the news yet. After a simple greeting, several people immediately reported to Dudian. Dean slightly raised his eyebrows. Dragon and Rock family have refused? Why? They didn't say why. I know. Dean turned and left the place. He flew out of here and stayed in the King's City. He was surprised that the Dragon family refused. After all, Aisha was the one who invited him. Moreover, Haley was in his hands. Why would the Dragon family refuse to cooperate with him? Did they know about Aisha's situation? Even if they knew, didn't they want to see her? Dean quietly drank a glass of the most expensive amber wine from the pub's owner. He could understand why the Rock family refused to cooperate. After all, their nest was destroyed by him. They wouldn't easily withdraw their forces to guard their nest. After all, the demon instrument was their foundation. Even though it wasn't destroyed this time, they should be scared. Little friend, move. A rude voice interrupted Dean's thoughts. Dudian glanced and saw a burly man. He was ugly, but he wore a big gold bracelet on his wrist. He was wearing a fluffy robe. It seemed that he had a good family background. He frowned and said in a cold voice, "Get lost. Kid, you." The burly man raised his thick eyebrows and stretched out his hand, wanting to scold him. Dean didn't wait for him to continue to be verbose. He slapped the burly man's body. The burly man's body rolled a few times and fell to the ground. Dean took off the gold bracelet from his wrist and threw it on the counter. Wine money. He went out of the tavern. He went to a nearby hotel with the name of a noble and booked a suite. He took out the god's marrow and injected it into his body. He stopped injecting the god's marrow into his body. Time flew by. In the blink of an eye, Dean stayed in the hotel for 2 days. He walked around the city and saw the destroyed palace. The whole palace was in a mess. There were several holes in the middle of the stairs. Although the scene had been surrounded and there were a lot of wall builders repairing it, but it was not difficult to imagine what kind of war had broken out at that time. Dean observed the situation in the palace with thermal vision. He only saw 7 or 8 pioneers. One of them had reached the inner wasteland level. These people were estimated to be most of the remaining forces in the palace. The monastery and the devil family seemed to be fine. What are they doing? Dean frowned. He had been staying in King's City for 2 days. He was always paying attention to the movement in the direction of the palace. At the same time, he spied on various aspects of intelligence. However, the information he got was still about the war in the Pagel Mountains. Moreover, the intelligence didn't mention the defeat of the Dragon family and the royal family. The news should have been blocked to avoid panic. Instead, it was said that the invading rebels had been beheaded. These invaders were defined as rebels in the outer wall according to the information they got from various sources. If they attacked the devil family, then even if the devil family didn't have enough time to spread the news, it should have taken such a long time. If the news was leaked, then the other devil families, the monastery, the magistrate and other forces were bound to gather together to fight against the enemy. But it wasn't like that. Dean's eyes flashed. It was hard to believe that these people had killed all the people from the devil family and the monastery. After all, although the devil family couldn't compete with them, but they had a large number of people. There were 6 of them in total. No matter how fast they killed, it was impossible for them to not spread the news, unless they sneaked in and assassinated them one by one. However, it was also possible that they didn't take action. Dean thought again and decided to observe for another day. On the 3rd day, the situation in the palace was still as usual. Dean didn't want to wait any longer. He returned to the intelligence center and asked about the reply from the Wing family and the magistrate. Master, the Wing family and the magistrate also refused our invitation. But the King's City came to us and said that they are willing to cooperate with us. The intelligence officer said. The King's City wants to cooperate with us? Dean was surprised. His biggest enemy was the King City. After all, the entire giant wall was under the jurisdiction of the royal family. The outer wall that he divided was the territory of the royal family. But now the only one who was willing to cooperate with him was the royal family. Reply to them that if they are willing to cooperate, they can come to Utopia Mountain in the outer wall to find me, Dean said. They invited you to meet them in the palace, the intelligence officer said. Dean shook his head. I won't go. Let them come and see me in my territory. I know, Speaker. Dean left and returned to the outer wall to wait for the arrival of the royal family. At the same time, he had used up the god's marrows. Half a day later, at dusk, Noyce came to the temple and said to Dean, Master, there are 2 people outside who claim to be from the royal family. They want to see you. Let them come up, Dean said. At the same time, he used the heat source to look at the 2 limitless figures on the steps of Wu Tuo Mountain. Chapter 769. After a while, Noyce led 2 middle-aged men into the shrine. They looked at the temple and then at Dean, who was sitting on the Pope's throne. The middle-aged man on the left asked, Are you the person in charge here? Dean indifferently asked, Who are you? The middle-aged man frowned as he saw Dean's arrogant attitude. I'm Stanley, the minister of the royal palace. The one next to me is Lord Henry. He is the right-hand man of Her Royal Highness Eureka. We have come to discuss cooperation with you. May I ask where Her Royal Highness Aisha is? After saying that, he glanced at the other places. She's resting, so it's inconvenient for her to meet the guest. I'm in charge of everything here. Dean quietly looked at him. He knew that this person should be the main person in charge of the meeting. His official position was higher than Lord Henry, who was next to him. Although the palace minister was equivalent to the imperial minister in ancient China and managed all the things in the royal family, but here the palace minister had a wider range of things, including various levels of communication meetings. The people who served as the palace minister were usually Earl level, which was also a higher level. He put away the contempt in his heart and said, Her Highness Yulita is very appreciative of Her Highness Aisha's character. You must have heard about the attack of the intruders. I won't repeat it. Now the group of intruders have left the giant wall. But there is a possibility that they are lurking in the dark. So just in case, I hope that Her Highness Aisha can respond to the signs and go to support them the next time they appear. Dean nodded, Of course. But you know that our outer wall is short of resources. Her Royal Highness Aisha needs God's marrows to enhance her strength. Do you have any idea? By the way, who is Her Royal Highness Eureka? Eureka is the only daughter of the ruler of the giant wall. She is the princess of the giant wall. She is replacing the ruler of the giant wall to manage the affairs of the giant wall. Stanley smiled. The royal family will naturally provide the god's marrows. I'll send someone to deliver it when I return. That's fine. Dean nodded. Her Highness Eureka should know about our temporary occupation of the outer wall. What does she think about it? Stanley's eyes flashed as he smiled. Her Highness Eureka has investigated the reason. Her Highness said that we can let bygones be bygones if the cooperation goes well. After all, this is an abandoned barbarian land. Her Highness Aisha wants it, so why not give it to her? Dean listened to his tone. Her Royal Highness Yulita's image emerged in his mind. She seemed to be a good person. He said, Your Royal Highness is so generous. We will come to make amends. Stanley smiled faintly and did not comment further. After talking for so long, aren't you going to give us a chair? Henry, who was beside him, reminded him with a displeased expression. Dean looked at him and waved to Noyce to take a seat. Dean said after both of them sat down, I've heard that the invaders have lost several people. In my opinion, the possibility of them fighting back is very high. I don't know if Her Royal Highness Yulita is prepared? Her Royal Highness is actively preparing. As long as they dare to come, we will catch them off guard. Stanley replied confidently. Dean chuckled in his heart. Most of these words were used to stabilize the morale of the army. The invaders wouldn't be able to withstand a single blow unless they had a dominator. He didn't point it out and continued to talk with them about the royal family. Dean sent them off after half an hour. The conversation went smoothly. Although Henry had a look of disdain in his eyes, Dean didn't care about it. In the face of the big picture, these little people were not worth mentioning unless they did something to interfere with him. It seems that the royal family is already prepared. If that's the case, I don't have to worry anymore. If they can invite me, they should also invite the Witch Clan and the Monster Research Institute. The combat power of the Monster Research Institute is not inferior to a single witch clan. Although there aren't many experts in it, the monsters they tamed are not weak. Dean was afraid of the Monster Research Institute. The first time he sneaked into the inner wall, he saw an extremely terrifying monster in the wilderness. It fed on the undeads. In retrospect, most of the monster's strength was at the peak of the outer wasteland. However, it's already been 3 days, yet they still haven't taken any action. It seems like they've learned their lesson from their previous losses. Dean thought. He wasn't worried about the inner wall attacking him in a short time. The longer the delay, the better it would be for him. After all, his power station and saltpeter mines were producing a lot of electricity and fire saltpeter every day. The more time passed, the more savings he would have. The next morning Dean received 500 bottles of God's marrows from the inner wall. This was beyond his expectation. It wasn't too much but too little. He had looted thousands of bottles of God's marrows from the Monster Research Institute. It seems that the royal family has sent me away like a beggar. Dean's eyes flashed coldly. He thought that Yulita was a good person, but it seemed that it was wishful thinking. However, his desire for God's marrows wasn't that big. He had a relatively rich reserve of God's marrows after plundering the rock. It was enough for him to advance to the inner wasteland level. Moreover, Xia Manson and Poland were producing God's marrows every day, so he didn't need to plunder anymore. Half a month passed in the blink of an eye. Dean absorbed God's marrows every day until his body reached saturation. It was almost the same as he expected. His physique had another breakthrough after half a month of continuous absorption. He had evolved from an ordinary pioneer to the peak of the outer wasteland. He was at the same level as the military god. Moreover, the changes brought about by his physique breakthrough was that his devil body was closer to that of a fiendish devil. His transformed appearance was even more sinister and terrifying, and he had fewer and fewer human characteristics. He estimated that when he reached the inner desolate rank or dominator rank, his body's outer appearance would be completely fiendish. He didn't know what form the Abyssal Walker would take after activating the demonic body, but it should be very distorted and terrifying. I don't know if I can win against an inner wasteland level expert. Dean was eager to try, but his reason told him that the chances of winning weren't too big. Although he had the magic marks of the splitter, but the magic marks of the inner wasteland powerhouses were legendary magic marks. This was the main limitation of the evolution to the inner wasteland. His advantage over the inner wasteland powerhouses was that he had the difference of deification. Deification would stimulate the new ability of the magic marks and also strengthen the original ability. But the difference between the physique of the peak of the outer wasteland and the inner wasteland was enough to offset the advantage of the magic marks. The only thing left was the combat experience and the on-the-spot reaction of both sides. It was hard to predict who would win or lose. I estimate that I will be promoted to the inner wasteland in a month with the current resources and absorption speed. This is the advantage of having a strong foundation. Dean was looking forward to this peaceful time. Nothing major had happened in the outer and inner wall in the last half a month. The group of invaders seemed to have disappeared, but he knew that they were hiding in the dark. He estimated that they were investigating and understanding the giant wall. They weren't as arrogant as before. This was more dangerous. Fortunately, this danger wouldn't come to his head first. Once there was a change in the inner wall, it meant that they would take action. They would try to get rid of the inner wall and find a way to deal with him. Maybe in the last half a month, they had investigated the location of the second base. They also knew about the process of him seizing the outer wall. If I can smoothly promote to the inner wasteland level before the war breaks out, then I can rely on my deification magic mark's ability to fight against the ruler. Dean hoped that the group of invaders would investigate in detail. The longer it dragged on, the better his advantage would be. Moreover, Aisha had suddenly awakened for the 5th time. Maybe it wouldn't be long before she would naturally awaken again. At that time, it would be the 6th awakening. Once she awakened for the 6th time, her combat strength would not be inferior to the ruler. In fact, she would be stronger than the majority of the rulers. If such a thing really happened, then he would have a complete victory. However, he couldn't figure out the natural awakening cycle of Aisha. If he had a microscope, then he could observe the virus fission in his body and calculate it. Time passed and the giant wall restored its calmness. The military of the inner wall accelerated the speed of the corpses in the cities. The corpses had been completely suppressed by the time Dean had advanced to the outer wasteland level. The inner wall started to restore the cities after the corpses were settled. The refugees were transported back to their respective cities, and order was restored. Everything was like new grass that was growing on a withered prairie. It was tenacious and full of vitality. Dean studied the super chip in addition to absorbing God's marrows every day. He sifted out the extremely effective technological items that could be produced in a short period of time. The atmosphere had become an upright faction in the temple of elements of the outer wall. The limelight of the atmosphere had overshadowed the other 9 factions after Barton was appointed as the pontiff. Some mages even called it the new century's invention. With the development of the chi element, it also brought about rapid progress in science and technology. Everything was restless, waiting to flourish. Half a month later, the nuclear haze that shrouded the sky gradually dissipated. The air returned to normal and the first rain fell after the new year. The black snow season was coming to an end. The rainy season of the new year was coming. I hope that the peace will continue for another half a month. Dean stood in front of the window and smoked. He blew the smoke out of the window and looked at the rain. The distant mountains and St. Mark's Square were shrouded in a blur. He finished the cigarette after a while. He stayed by the window for a while and took a few deep breaths. After dispersing the smoke in his mouth, he returned to the temple's desk. Aisha was sitting quietly on the chair next to him, accompanying him. Dean felt that the calmness at the moment was rare. But he knew that the storm would come and the rain would get heavier. If only I could make the phonograph. Dean looked at Aisha with gentle eyes. His heart was full of regret. If he could make the phonograph, then he would be able to retain her voice. Unfortunately, he was busy with things that could enhance his strength at that time. If it were now, he would rather use 1 or even 10 or even 100 legendary magic to replace a gramophone. But he had missed it. No amount of remedies would be able to bring it back. The heavy rain fell rhythmically on the windows of the temple. It floated over the entire mountain and into the inner wall. The palace that was destroyed had been repaired. Eureka was sitting in the hall. She was wearing a light red robe and holding a scepter. She listened to the general who was next to her. "Your Majesty, more than a month has passed. The group of thieves has long left. What are we waiting for? General Clinton, don't be impatient. After all, Aisha has awakened the 5th time. It will be too difficult for us to recapture the outer wall with our current strength. Yes, let's wait for a while." Several people tried to persuade him. Yulita looked at Clinton and raised her hand to stop him. "I know what you are worried about, but we can't have any more internal friction in the short term. It doesn't matter if Aisha has 5th awakening or not. Even if it is fake, she should have at least 4th awakening. We can only rely on force to make her surrender." This group of invaders made us lose 2 marshals. We have to recuperate for some time." Clinton sighed. "I'm afraid that they are making progress while we are resting. They are in the dark while we are in the light." Eureka shook her head. "No need to say more." The heavy rain bathed the palace. In the heavy rain outside the palace, 6 figures in raincoats stood in the corner of a building. Their gazes were cold as they stared at the towering palace. After a while, one of them said, "Big brother, with such heavy rain, they probably won't go out today. Brother, this is a good opportunity." The old man stared at the palace for a moment and nodded. "Let's go." "Good." The others immediately followed. There was excitement in their eyes. Half an hour later, everyone appeared outside a plaza 2 districts away from the palace. This plaza was the altar where the palace worshipped the gods. In the center was a towering stone platform with 2 angel statues on it. In the center was a stone statue that was about 10 meters tall. It was an extremely beautiful woman whose age could not be seen. She looked like a young girl in her 20s, but also a mature woman in her 30s. She wore a strange skirt on her lower body. Everyone who lived in King City knew that this was the well-known goddess of war, Sylvia. Chapter 770. 6 people suddenly jumped out and rushed towards the statue in front of the square. A group of ordinary soldiers was stationed in front of the statue. They wore black raincoats and stood in front of the statue like ghosts in the heavy rain. 6 figures crossed through the curtain of rain and instantly arrived in front of the soldiers. They didn't make any sound as they killed the soldiers. After dealing with the guards, the 6 of them quickly rushed up the altar and pushed down the statue. The statue didn't fall to the ground. Instead, it was tilted in the heavy rain by the fat man. The stooped old man looked at the altar below the statue. Just as he thought, there was a deep, pitch-black hole here that led to the underground. He hesitated because of the loss he had suffered in the palace. But he quickly dispelled the concerns and took the lead to rush down. At the moment the rain was pouring down on the street. There were no pedestrians. The doors and windows of the buildings near the square were closed to prevent the rain from seeping into the homes. However, in one of the hotel rooms, although the transparent glass window was closed, the curtains were not drawn. A white-haired old man, who looked to be in his 70s, was sitting by the window with a glass of red wine in his hand. He was quietly sipping it, but his eyes were fixed on the rainstorm outside. To be more precise, his eyes were fixed on the statue in the rainstorm. When the statue of God tilted, the old man's thoughts suddenly jolted and he woke up. He was stunned for a while before he suddenly stood up from the chair. His eyes widened as he pushed open the window and stretched his head out to look, completely ignoring the rain pouring in from outside. Soon, he saw the fat man holding the statue of God, as well as the hunchbacked old man and the others. Intruders! His pupils shrank and his heart was filled with horror. He hurriedly lifted his leg, preparing to jump out of the window. However, he suddenly thought of something and quickly retracted his leg. He turned around and ran to the other side of the room. His movements were so fast that he knocked over a bottle of expensive red wine that cost at least 1,000 gold coins. He ran to the front of a small cage, and in this cage was a small pitch-black mouse. It looked no different from an ordinary mouse, but it was not an ordinary mouse. If one looked closely, they would find that there was a ring-shaped outline inside its ears. This was a sound-seeking mouse. It was also one of the favorite messenger pets of the dark believers in the outer wall. The old man tore the cage and took out the sound-seeking mouse. He took out a small wooden tube from the bottom of a pen holder and hung it in front of the mouse's chest. He patted the mouse's hair and said anxiously, "Go!" Once the sound-seeking mouse regained its freedom, it quickly ran away. In the blink of an eye, it jumped out of the crack in the door and disappeared. The old man took a deep breath after releasing the sound-seeking mouse. He turned to the window and took out a black cloth that was hanging behind the chair. There was a black sword wrapped inside. The sword wasn't wide. It was curved like a sword. It had a very capable temperament. Holding the saber, he lifted his leg and stepped on the window, leaping down from the hotel that was more than 10 stories high. 4 or 5 floors below, a couple was making out by the window. They didn't close the curtains. When the man was about to kiss his girlfriend who had her eyes closed, he suddenly saw a figure falling from the window behind her. He immediately screamed in shock. "Second brother, someone is coming." The graceful woman was about to jump into the deep hole under the statue. Suddenly, her eyes moved. She turned to look at the back of the square. There, a black shadow was rapidly approaching. His body exuded an amazing heat. It was not inferior to them. She narrowed her eyes and said, "I didn't expect that there would be a hidden master here. I didn't find him before." "Third sister, leave it to me. You defend." The burly man's eyes were full of murderous intent. He pulled out the sword and rushed out. The rainwater surged on the back of the sword. "I'm going too," the sixth brother, whose cheeks had been destroyed, said as he quickly rushed over. He was worried that the battle would fall into a stalemate with his fourth brother alone and cause too much of a commotion. In the blink of an eye, both of them met the old man. The black sword in the old man's hand melted as it rushed out. The old man entered the demonic body state. His whole body was like a humanoid lizard, but his body was like an insect. There was a network of muscle lines. It looked extremely strange. Seeing this strange demonic body, the burly man recognized it at a glance. He growled, "It's their legendary monster, Shadow Hunter. Kill." Old Six made up his mind. Without another word, he entered the demonic body and rushed over. Fighting 1 against 2, the old man fell into a disadvantageous position in the blink of an eye. In fact, just dealing with one person made him feel strenuous. After all, although his magic mark was legendary, the biggest strength of the Shadow Hunter was to lurk and assassinate, not to fight head-on. It was just that the current situation made him unable to lurk and assassinate. He could only jump out to pin them down, hoping to delay the arrival of the reinforcements. "Go to hell." The old man's claws were like knives. His originally kind and ordinary face was filled with ferocity. He roared and rushed toward the weaker old Six. The heavy rain washed down like the sea, covering the figures of the 3 people. In the palace, Yulita was having a meeting with a group of generals and counts. Although the things they were discussing were of no value to her, she had to find a topic to keep these people here. After all, to the forces like the Witcher clan and the Demonic Creature Research Institute, the loss of the god's corpse was a devastating blow. They should not remain calm. The pace of the meeting was very slow. The heavy rain outside made the generals and counts unwilling to end the meeting so early. After all, going out in a rainstorm, even if there was a carriage to pick them up, it was easy to dirty their boots. In this quiet meeting, no one knew how long it had been. Suddenly, a female officer trotted in from the side hall, bypassed the generals in the meeting room, and came in front of Yulita. She turned sideways and handed her a small note. Seeing the anxious expression on her face, Yulita's heart sank slightly, but on the surface she maintained a calm expression. She glanced at the generals in the room. Some of the generals and counts who were looking at her saw her gaze and immediately looked away, as if nothing had happened. They continued to chat with the people beside them, but their eyes would inadvertently sweep over Yulita. Yulita's fingers were very dexterous. She quickly rolled up the note into a ball. When she saw the few words on the note, her eyes widened and she suddenly stood up from her chair. Her face was full of shock and disbelief. This huge commotion immediately caused the whispers in the conference room to stop. Everyone looked at her in shock. Yulita, on the other hand, felt a little lack of oxygen in her brain and a wave of dizziness. After a while, she recovered and immediately shouted, "Immediately gather everyone and head to the altar. The intruders have returned. They want to steal the god's remains under the statue of Sylvia." "What? How is this possible? Isn't the god's remains already?" The generals and counts present were dumbfounded. They were so shocked that they didn't know what to do. However, Yulita didn't have the time to explain anything to them. She took the lead and rushed out of the palace. Chapter 771. When Yulita arrived at the square, she saw that the towering statue of God had collapsed on the square. The perfect face on the statue was plastered on the muddy water, allowing the dirty rainwater to wash it away. On the altar where the statue had stood, there was a huge hole. She was stunned for a second before she rushed to the altar. She saw that the hole under the altar had been destroyed by someone. There were dents on the periphery of the hole made by swords. She quickly jumped into the hole. Below the hole was a secret chamber made of granite. The area of the secret chamber was not large, and there were no extra items on display. At this moment it was empty. The last trace of hope in her heart was instantly extinguished. She stood in the secret chamber blankly, as if she had lost her soul. Her eyes were dull. After a long, long time, she slowly came back to her senses. The corner of her mouth moved slightly. She turned around and silently crawled out of the secret chamber. At this time, she saw the rest of the counts and generals rushing over. However, among them, there were a few noble counts who came in carriages. They were also wearing raincoats, and there were servants holding umbrellas beside them for fear of being splashed by the rain. When she saw the appearance of these people, a bitter smile appeared on her beautiful face. "Your Highness, Your Highness!" One of the generals, who was completely soaked, hurriedly ran over. He opened the umbrella in his hand and covered Yulita's head. He said with concern, "Your Highness, are you all right? What did you mean when you said that the sacred remains had been stolen? Did the group of invaders come here?" As he spoke, he glanced around. When he saw the hole under the altar, his expression changed slightly. He seemed to have thought of something. At this time, the other generals and counts also gathered around. "Your Highness, didn't the group of invaders leave? They are still here? My God, this is too dangerous. Don't they intend to leave?" The earls looked around nervously, fearing that the invaders would suddenly appear. They had heard the inside story of the Pagel Mountains and knew how terrifying this group of invaders was. It was not the case of complete victory and expulsion of the invaders that had been spread by the commoners. Facing the almost interrogative tone of the earls, Yulita indifferently lowered her head. She looked extremely embarrassed at the moment. Her hair was messy and wet from the rain, draping over her cheeks. After a moment of silence, she suddenly thought of something. Her nose gently sniffed, and her expression immediately changed. She quickly pushed through the crowd and rushed into the curtain of rain. Soon, he arrived at the building at the outer edge of the square. There was an alley here, and at the entrance of the alley, there was an old man lying face down. His hair was white and he was lying face down on the ground. The rainwater under his body was dyed red, and his blood flowed along with the rain into the surrounding sewers. Eureka's face was pale, and she hurriedly went forward to pick him up, only to find that he had already stopped breathing. His wrinkled face was frighteningly pale, and there was a huge hole in his chest. His heart was missing, and there were a few claw marks on his throat. One of his arms was broken, and his abdomen was torn open, with his intestines hanging below his hip bone. He had died a horrible death, and it was not hard to imagine what kind of terrifying battle he had gone through. "Uncle Mick!" Yulita hissed in grief. She hugged him and burst into tears. Tears and rainwater mixed together and slid down her face. It was as if the heavens were pitying her. However, she felt that the cold rain was so heartless. After the grief and indignation, only hatred was left in her heart. She slowly returned to the square with the old man's body in her arms. A group of generals and earls came to greet her, looking at her with concern. Some of them noticed the old man in her arms, but they were puzzled. "Your Highness, who is this man? He is the intruder?" Everyone looked puzzled. Yulita remained silent. When she heard someone say that he was the intruder, her expression changed a little. She raised her head and expressionlessly said, "He is the person that my father trusted the most. He has been living here, pretending to be an ordinary lonely old man, and guarding the immortal's corpse. The last time the god's coffin was stolen by the intruder, it was just a smokescreen. The immortal's corpse was not inside, but this time, the immortal's corpse is really gone. Hearing her words, everyone looked at each other and saw the shock in each other's eyes. Your Highness, what you said, is it true? A general could not help but ask. Yulita looked at him expressionlessly and said, If we can't get the immortal's corpse back, you will see with your own eyes whether the immortal's corpse is lost or not after a while. The general's expression changed, and he could not help but shiver. Your Highness, the immortal's corpse is so important. How can it be hidden in a place like the altar? Isn't this nonsense? A earl in his 50s with white hair on his temples reprimanded in shock and anger. Yulita raised her eyelids and glanced at him. She said, This was arranged by my father. If you have any objections, you can wait for my father to come back and talk to him. Besides, even if it was arranged under the palace, wasn't it still robbed? Is the defense there weak? The earl's expression changed slightly, and he was speechless. Your Highness, other than you, who else knows that the immortal's corpse is hidden here? How did these invaders know about it? Yes, we have been here for so many years, but we did not know that the immortal's corpse was hidden here. How did these intruders find it? There must be a traitor. Hearing their words, Yulita felt a sense of irritation in her heart. One could even say that she was manic. However, she had strong self-control. Her fingers slightly tightened and she took a deep breath. She said coldly, Other than me, my father, and Uncle Mick, no one else knows about this. After the fake coffin under the palace was robbed, I never came here. I was worried that they would follow me and track me here, but they still found this place. How is this possible? Could it be that Mick leaked the secret? He died in battle. How could he leak the secret? Let's not talk about the strangeness of this matter for now. Right now, retrieving the immortal's corpse is our top priority. Since it has already been robbed, what's the point of thinking so much? If these intruders return to their territory, we will be completely finished. That's right. Let's think about how to retrieve the immortal's corpse first. Yulita acted as if she did not hear the crowd's discussion. Her gaze slowly shifted to a spot outside the plaza. If one looked closely, there was a faint smell of blood on this path. Although it was covered by the rain, and the smell was extremely faint, it should be the direction that the intruders left in. After a moment of silence, she said, Inform Dragon Mother, Rock Demon, and King E of the Hunter family. Tell them about this and ask them to lead their pioneers to stop the invaders. I'll go ahead and see if I can follow them. I'll leave my scent along the way so that they can follow my scent. Your Highness, you want to go personally? How can you do that? There are Dominator experts among them. Your Highness, you should stay here and take charge of the situation. Several generals and earls hurriedly advised. Chapter 772. On the giant wall in the heavy rain. 6 figures leaped up and stood on the wide walkway. The burly man and the fat man gently placed a 7 to 8 meter long, oval-shaped metal ball on the ground. The metal ball looked like a mango, flat and round. There were many solidified gray shells on its surface. Under the washing of the rain, pieces of bright silver metal could be seen. There were streamlined metal patterns on the surface of the metal, and it looked very simple. Big brother, let's inspect the goods, the graceful woman said to the old man. The old man looked around. The rain is too heavy here. The corpses of the gods will be polluted if we open the coffin. Let's find a clean place first. Then let's go to the outer wall and find a place to settle down. I don't think they will come here. Even if they come, we won't be afraid as long as we have the corpses of the gods in our hands. All right. They quickly made a decision. They moved the coffin and went along the wall. After a while they arrived at a village on the outskirts of the outer wall. They sneaked into a farmer's house. The torrential rain poured down and lightning flashed, illuminating the world occasionally. In the spacious living room, the farmer and his wife were lying on the floor, their necks bent at a 90-degree angle. Their 2 daughters, who were studying medicine in the bedroom, were also lying on the table and the floor. Blood flowed from the corners of their mouth. Their necks were also broken, and it was done by the same person. Only the old man and the others were left in the house. They moved the oval metal ball into the farmer's cowshed. The cowshed was large enough to hold the huge metal ball. The cows inside were all killed and piled up in a corner of the cowshed. The 6 of them surrounded the metal ball. The hunchbacked old man reached out to wipe away the dirt on the surface of the metal ball. Soon, he found a gap thinner than a strand of hair on the edge of the metal ball. In addition, there was a raised metal plate in the middle of the gap. The old man frowned. The shape of the coffin was completely different from the fake one they had seized. It didn't look like a coffin at all. The surface of the coffin didn't have the engravings of the goddess of war and the monsters. It was too ordinary and low-key. "Big brother, how do we open this thing? Is it locked?" The burly man and Fatty looked at the strange shape of this thing and didn't know where to start. The stooped old man pondered for a moment and tried to move his palm against the metal plate. However, the metal plate was firmly fixed. Just as he was about to withdraw his hand, the metal ball suddenly trembled, scaring the few of them. After all, they had been injured by the poisonous gas released by the fake last time. They had suffered quite a bit and it had left a lot of trauma. Just as the hunchbacked old man retracted his palm, a pleasant female voice came from behind the metal plate. The female voice spoke in a language that the 6 of them had never heard before. When they heard this female voice, the 6 of them retreated in fear, their faces filled with horror. The hunchbacked elder was also shocked. He stared at the metal ball in shock. This voice, could it be the goddess of battles inside? Was she not dead? The fatty, the graceful woman, and the others had the same thought. They looked at each other and saw the disbelief in each other's eyes. Remember that the goddess of battles was 300 years old. How could she still be alive? Also, if she was alive, how could she let them kill their way into the wall? The sweet-sounding female voice repeated the strange language from before. Then, with 2 beeps, the metal plate lit up with a red light, and then the voice went silent. The hunchbacked old man waited for more than 10 minutes. Only when the voice stopped did he heave a sigh of relief. However, he discovered that his back was drenched in sweat. He turned to look at the graceful woman and asked, "Is there a living creature inside?" The graceful woman shook her head. When the female voice appeared, she used her ability to sense it. "There is no sign of life. Big brother, didn't the wall lord say that the goddess of battles died a long time ago?" The 6th brother, whose face was ruined, said in a shaky voice. The hunchbacked elder stared at the coffin for a moment and said in a low voice, "Step back a bit." The others heard this and immediately moved back a bit. The hunchbacked elder carefully raised his hand and patted the metal ball a few times, but there was no response. He was a little relieved and said, "It seems that this should be something similar to the phonograph of the wall master. It left her previous voice here. It is not her who spoke." The others heaved a sigh of relief. If this Valkyrie was still alive, she would probably be able to kill them easily with a lift of her finger. How could she allow them to fool around like this? The hunchbacked elder carefully examined the ball. After a moment of consideration, he took out his sword and used it to cut the small gap on the edge of the metal ball. After several failed attempts, the blade finally cut into the gap. He immediately used his strength to pry it up. Crack! The metal ball made a cracking sound and slightly loosened up. The hunchbacked elder adjusted the blade and used the same method to pry it open in other places. 10 minutes later, the small gap on the outside of the metal ball became half a centimeter wide. The hunchbacked elder melted the sword and entered the demon form. He told the others to step back and then used his demon claw to grab the edge of the metal ball and lifted it up. A gust of cold air came out of the metal ball. The cold air was exactly the same as the fake divine coffin. The hunchbacked elder's pupil shrank as he hurriedly stepped back. Soon, the cold air spread out and gradually spread. The surrounding temperature dropped sharply. Even the heavy rain that fell on the cowshed suddenly became lighter. Because the cold air was absorbed by the top of the cowshed, it condensed into a thick layer of ice crystals. If the 6 people were standing outside the cowshed, they would notice that the rainwater that fell on the cowshed was frozen into ice as soon as it splashed. The temperature in the cowshed quickly dropped below zero. The spread of the cold air became wider and wider, and the rainwater flowing down the edge of the cowshed turned into icicles. The entire cowshed was soon frozen into an ice room, including the dead cows piled up in the corner. All of their bodies stiffened, and the blood that flowed out froze into ice. After a while, when the cold air almost dissipated, the hunchbacked elder tentatively reached out his hand to touch a little bit of the cold air. He only felt that his fingertips were cold, but other than that, he didn't feel any discomfort. He tried again and finally came to the conclusion that the cold air was different from the last time. It wasn't poisonous, but pure cold air. After knowing that the cold air was not poisonous, he immediately rushed into the cowshed. However, just in case, he still held his breath and looked into the oval metal sphere. He saw a faint white gas drifting inside, and in the haze, a perfectly proportioned snow-white naked body was lying inside, as if it was in a deep sleep. When he saw the face of the body, he heaved a sigh of relief. This appearance matched the information he received for the mission. This was Goddess Sylvia. His gaze landed on her body. She was completely naked, with nothing covering her body, including the private parts of her lower body. However, there was not a hint of lust in his eyes. Instead, the more he looked, the more frightened he became. There was no sign of life in this Goddess Sylvia's body. She was undoubtedly a dead person. However, her corpse's skin was more lustrous and tender than a living person's. Logically speaking, after more than 300 years, even if it wasn't rotten, it would at least be a dried corpse. However, Sylvia's corpse was like a living person in a deep sleep. There wasn't a single wrinkle on her skin. This could be explained by the cold air, but there was another point that made him feel incredulous. That was, Sylvia's lower body from the waist down wasn't made up of human legs. Instead, it was a lump of disgusting, grotesque limbs. It was a stark contrast to her perfect upper body. Her upper body was like a god's, but her lower body was like a devil from hell. He stared at her in a daze. Because he was entranced, he stared for a long time. Suddenly, he seemed to see the god's corpse open her eyes. It was a pair of extremely deep and resplendent eyes that seemed to contain the endless starry sky. They were high above, filled with holiness, and yet emotionless, looking down at him. Compared to her cold gaze, her cheeks seemed to reveal a smile. The corners of her mouth curled up slightly. Just this slight expression alone made her extremely dazzling. She was filled with irresistible charm and extremely feminine charm. The group of disgusting, grotesque limbs under her body also seemed to be wriggling slightly, trying to climb out of the metal ball. "No!" The hunchbacked elder roared and took a few steps back. Everything in front of him suddenly disappeared like an illusion. Everything returned to what he saw before. Sylvia was still lying quietly in the metal ball. Her eyes were closed as if she was in a deep sleep. The horrifying limbs on her lower body also maintained their previous posture and didn't change at all. However, the fantasy-like scene from before lingered in his mind for a long time. His face was pale and he gasped for breath. He had an urge to immediately escape from this place. "Big brother!" "What's wrong, big brother?" The fatty, the graceful woman, and the others heard the sound and rushed in. When they saw the hunchbacked elder's appearance, they were shocked. They saw that he seemed to have experienced an intense battle. In this extremely cold cowshed, he was sweating profusely and gasping for breath. "I'm fine." The hunchbacked elder took a deep breath and slowly calmed his violently beating heart. He still felt palpitations in his heart. He didn't dare to look at the body that was a combination of holiness and evil. He felt that it took a great deal of courage to even stay beside this thing. However, he could be sure that this corpse wasn't fake. It was a genuine god's corpse. This is the War God clan? The structure of her body, how could it be? The graceful woman and the others also noticed Sylvia in the metal ball. When they saw the horrifying structure of her lower body, their expressions instantly changed. The hunchbacked elder took a deep breath and said, "Don't stare too much. This thing is a little evil. No wonder it could suppress the god wall even after death." The burly man screamed and stepped back a few steps. His legs were trembling and his forehead was full of sweat. His eyes were full of horror. When the hunchbacked old man saw him like this, he knew that he had probably seen the same horrifying fantasy as himself. He stepped forward and pushed the other half of the metal sphere up, covering it. When the sphere covered Sylvia's beautiful face, he seemed to see her eyes open. His heart trembled, and he didn't dare to think too much. He quickly fastened the metal sphere tightly, and in his heart, he even regretted opening this thing. Now that we have the god's corpse, what should we do next? According to the previous plan, the hunchbacked elder gritted his teeth. Eureka quickly climbed the giant wall. She looked at the muddy water left on the wall. She knew that the previous invaders had been here. She looked around but didn't see any footprints or traces. As for the smell, it had long been washed away by the heavy rain. She wasn't good at tracking smell. Have they escaped from the giant wall? She looked at the vast hunting area in front of her. She could vaguely see some huge monsters crawling in the rain. Her face turned ugly as she clenched her teeth. After a moment, several figures swept over. They were generals. All of them had the strength of pioneers. "Your Majesty, have you found them?" Eureka shook her head. The anger in her eyes had long calmed down. She was silent for a moment. "Immediately gather people and prepare for a comprehensive search. We must find them before they enter the abyss." The generals looked at each other and immediately complied. What a big rain! Dean stood by the window, looking at the cloudy sky. Occasionally he could hear a few thunders like the angry roar of the god. Such a big rain, it should be able to cover the entire range of the giant wall. "Master." Noise came out of the temple and called out. Dean looked at him. "Come in." Noise crossed the threshold and quickly walked into the temple. "The king of the inner wall has sent a letter to summon you and Her Highness Aisha." Dudian was startled. His eyes lit up. "I know." Noise hesitated for a moment before whispering, "Young master, will they deliberately summon you to deal with you?" "I don't know." Dean shook his head and looked at the sky. "I hope they won't be so stupid." Dean took some battle items with him and left the temple. He went to the inner wall alone. Even if he couldn't beat the master of the inner barren level, he could escape back to the outer wall. After all, the journey wasn't far unless they set up a trap. But even if Aisha went with him, it wouldn't be of any help. Dean arrived at the inner wall after a moment. He did not go straight to the palace but observed from the periphery for a while. He saw that there were many figures with strong heat energy gathered inside. Among them, there were 4 inner barren level heat energy figures, and he knew all 4 of them. He had seen them during the battle at the Pagel Mountains. They were from the 3 hunter families. Chapter 773. Who are you? Stop. The guard at the bottom of the palace stopped Dean and shouted. Her Highness Yulida has invited me here. Please inform her. Dean's attitude was humble and polite. The guard looked at him up and down and said, Please tell me your name. Dean. You wait here. I'll go inform her. The guard's attitude was not so polite. There was a sense of superiority in his eyes. After a moment, the guard returned. His attitude was obviously much more respectful. His waist was also hunched. Mr. Dean, please. Thousands of steps made the palace look like a divine palace. It was solemn and dignified. When Dean came to the front of the palace, he saw many extraordinary figures gathered in the hall from the open door. Some of them were people he knew, including 1 or 2 pioneers who served as elders of Dragon Clan. With the strength of pioneers, these 2 elders were fully qualified to sit in the palace. But at this moment they were standing. There were not many chairs in the huge palace. Only 4 or 5 people were sitting. Among them, sitting in front of the dragons, was a graceful and elegant lady in a gorgeous robe. Her eyebrows were faintly similar to Aisha and Hathaway. However, she had a more mature and charming charm than the 2. However, this charming flavor seemed a bit cold under her indifferent expression. It made people unable to raise their thoughts of blasphemy. When Dean came to the door, someone had noticed him and turned to look at him. Yulita was sitting on the throne at the top of the hall. She was holding a scepter and wearing a crown. Her face was dignified at the moment. Her heroic eyebrows gave people an inviolable feeling. Although she was young, her momentum was not weak. She looked down and saw Dean outside the hall. She immediately got up and waved to Dean. Dean calmly stepped into the hall. His eyes swept across the faces of the people sitting in the hall. Most of the people who were looking at him were a bit curious and had bad intentions. Among them, there were obvious hatred in their eyes. Dean knew that they had recognized his identity, but he did not care. "Your Highness, this is?" a black-robed old man from the monastery asked. Dean looked at him and narrowed his eyes. He had seen this person before. He knew the other party, and the other party also knew him. He was the one who had secretly captured him and brought him to the monastery. Dean sneered. "Elder, how long has it been since we last met? Don't you recognize me?" Emoglang's face darkened and he said coldly, "When did I know you? It seems that you are old and forgetful. I didn't expect your monastery to be so short of people. You have a forgetful old man fighting in the front line." Dean didn't seem to be afraid of offending people. "You." Emoglang was furious and took a step forward. The burly Dean who was sitting in the chair in front of him raised his hand to stop him. "Are you the one who used despicable means to take away the outer wall and try to take it for yourself? You really are as arrogant and ignorant as the rumors say." Everyone. Suddenly a loud and clear voice echoed out, "Don't forget why we are here today. Mr. Dean was invited by me. I can let bygones be bygones as long as Mr. Dean is willing to join us. I hope that everyone will keep in mind that the god's corpse has been stolen. Do you need me to repeat the serious consequences of this matter?" Eureka was the one who spoke. Everyone looked at her and then at Dean but didn't say anything. Emoglang didn't intend to let Dean go. "Your Highness, you let such a person join our team to fight against the invaders. What if he stabs us in the back? This kid is very insidious. He can do anything. I think the Dragon Clan has a deep understanding of this point." Dean squinted at him. "Didn't you say that you don't know me? How do you know that I'm insidious? Do you people from the monastery like to slander people? If that's all you have, then I really feel sorry for you and all the civilians. Oh, I forgot, you're an elder of the punishment department. You're only in charge of brainless things like fighting and killing, so it's understandable that you're forgetful." "You." Emoglang was so angry that he couldn't speak. "Don't involve the Dragon Clan in whatever you want to do. I'm not familiar with you." The elegant lady who was sitting on the chair looked at Dean. She retracted her gaze and said indifferently. Emoglang's face changed. If it was just Dean, then it would be okay. But the attitude of the Dragon Clan was different. Did the Dragon Clan reconcile with Dean? Dean looked at the Dragon Mother. He was surprised but didn't think much about it. In any case, the Dragon Clan's way of dealing with Aisha had disappointed him. It was unforgivable. It was also the first time for Yulita to see Dean. She didn't expect that the person who had stirred up the outer wall would be around the same age as her. She was surprised but also curious. Dean's performance gave her a headache. He liked to stir up trouble. It was hard to appease him. She changed the topic. "Today we have gathered here. I hope that everyone can put down the hatred in the past. Now that the enemy is in front of us, we should unite against the common enemy. In any case, the first goal is to recapture the god's corpse. Yes. Dean nodded in agreement. The others who wanted to speak in favor of Eureka didn't speak as they saw Dean seconding the motion. Dean didn't care about their eyes. He looked at Eureka. Your Highness, can you let me sit down and talk? The people who were prejudiced against Dean were angry. Emoglang sneered. You? You want to sit down? Do you know who is sitting here? What are you? You're just a lowly person from the outer wall. It seemed that he realized that his words were too much. Although he thought that it was a bit inappropriate to say it out loud, so he immediately stopped. Dean looked at him but didn't say anything. He looked up at Eureka. Eureka felt a headache. Dean was really good at stirring up trouble for her. He asked for a seat as soon as he came up. The people who were sitting in the hall were the highest leaders of the various forces. If she let Dean sit, then it was tantamount to looking down on the others. If she didn't, then she was worried that she would anger Dean. After all, the god's corpse had been stolen. With the help of Aisha, who had awakened 5 times, the chances of recapture the god's corpse would greatly increase. She hesitated for a moment and said, "All right, sit with Mr. Dean." There was a commotion in the hall. There was some dissatisfaction. "Mr. Dean, why didn't Her Highness Aisha come?" Eureka immediately pointed out Aisha's name. She wanted to tell the others that Dean was here for her sake. "I'll handle this small matter. She's resting at home." "Resting? Don't let her rest when she's going to fight." Emoglang sneered. He didn't miss any opportunity to attack Dean. Dean didn't look at him again, as if he didn't hear anything. His disregard made Emoglang's sneer turn gloomy. Soon, the seats were moved and Dean naturally sat down. Dragon Mother, Abbot and others were calm. They knew that Yulita valued Aisha behind Dean. That's why she gave him a seat. Therefore, she didn't want to lower herself to Dean's level. "Your Majesty, can we discuss business now?" the burly man asked. He was the previous patriarch of the Rock family. His nickname was Rock Devil. Eureka nodded. "It's been a month since the Pagar Mountains. I thought that the intruders had left after they took the fake coffin. I didn't expect them to lurk here. They should have found that there was no god's corpse in the coffin when they left. So they are waiting for an opportunity. Their plan is very thorough and they caught us off guard. Now they have stolen the real god's corpse. I saw the traces left by them on the giant wall. I guess they have left the giant wall. But there is still a long way to go from the giant wall to the abyss area. They should take a rest. This is our chance to catch up with them." "Your Majesty." The rock demon's eyes were like torches as he said, "Last time, I asked you if the immortal's corpse was real. You said it was. This time, you said it was real. I want to know if it is real or not." Eureka had expected that they would ask such a question. She looked at Rock Devil and said, "This time it is real. I didn't mean to deceive you last time. The fake coffin was my father's idea. He was worried that other people would come and steal the god's corpse. So he hid the real god's corpse under the altar and the fake one under the palace. I believe that all of you know that the immortal's remains are hidden under the palace. It's not hard to find out. But the only people who know that the immortal's remains are under the altar, besides Uncle Mick, who is already dead, are me and my father. The purpose of this is to prevent the intruders from sneaking into the palace. They will learn about the real god's corpse from your mouth. That's why we have strictly blocked the information." The Rock Devil stared at her for a moment and nodded. "I believe it is true this time. But the last time you lied to us, we can't let it go so easily. I will report to the Wall Master and ask him to give us an explanation. Your Majesty, if you didn't lie to us last time, we would have taken advantage of that man's injury to attack them. They would have been dead by now." "Yes." The middle-aged man with aquiline nose who was sitting next to him said in a cold voice, "If we knew that there was no god's corpse in the coffin, then we could have killed all of them. But the result was good. Not only did the god's corpse recover, but he also took them out of the encirclement. Your Majesty, you have harmed all of us this time. Dean noticed that one of the sleeves of the man was empty. There were several new scars and corroded folds on the face and neck of the man. It was estimated that they were caused by the last battle in the Pagil Mountains. Eureka's face turned ugly. She knew that she couldn't absolve herself from the blame, but she also had her own considerations. The reason why she didn't tell them was because she wanted to keep the information about the real god's corpse a secret. She was worried that there were other invaders lurking in the giant wall. Moreover, at that time, she didn't know that there was a Dominator-level powerhouse among the 6 invaders. After that Dominator rushed out of the palace, he didn't make a single move, so they mistook him for a master from the inner wilderness. That was why they were caught unprepared and defeated. This matter is over. Now we should think about how to take back the god's corpse. Dragon Mother frowned. Eureka took a deep breath. I am responsible for this matter. But I ask everyone to think about how to get back the god's corpse. I'm afraid that something big will happen before my father comes back if the god's corpse is taken away by them. The area outside the giant wall is vast. If they have the intention to hide, finding them is like looking for a needle in a haystack. Even if we find them, we can't beat them. The monastery's dean sighed. We don't know how many Wings families Bat Voice and Magic Marks pioneers are. If they lead a team to search, there might be a chance. Rock Devil glanced at the hook-nosed middle-aged man. Including me, there are 4 of them. The hook-nosed middle-aged man said calmly. Dean sat on the side and listened to their conversation. He suddenly thought of a possibility. He knew that the intruders wouldn't leave, or they couldn't leave. They must still be lurking around the giant wall. But they weren't in a hurry to make a move. Obviously, they didn't intend to act recklessly like before. Even if they went out to search for these people according to the method discussed by Eureka and the others, it would greatly reduce the defense power inside the giant wall. If they casually destroyed the inside of the giant wall, no one could stop them. They could even ambush outside the giant wall and kill the teams that went out to search for them one by one. Eureka and the others obviously thought of this, but they had to hold on to a glimmer of hope to try and recover. Something big happened before the Wall Lord came back. What could happen without the god's corpse? Dean fell into thought about Eureka's words. It made him quite curious. Instead, he wanted to see what would happen after the god's corpse was stolen. But he had an intuition that it was better not to happen. Otherwise, it would be very bad. These invaders will definitely kill them one by one. From the looks of it now, if I follow the path they discussed, the chances of them being wiped out are very high. This is a good thing for me, but without them as a shield, the next invaders will be more difficult to deal with. I need time to accumulate more electricity and gunpowder. If I can slow down their killing efficiency. Dean's eyes flashed as he lowered his head to think. Chapter 774. Dean's thoughts were interrupted. He didn't need to look to know that the person who spoke was Embark. He didn't have a good idea for the time being, so he naturally wouldn't put forward any suggestions. He said in a cold voice, "My idea is that you should shut your mouth. Don't interrupt the meeting if you don't have a brain. You will only delay everyone's time. Do you understand?" He didn't care about Dean's feelings, especially the last rhetorical question. It was very easy to arouse people's rebellious heart. Embark wanted to make a fool of Dean to retaliate for his previous arrogant attitude. But he didn't expect Dean's temper to be more fiery than he had imagined. It was completely different from the obedient appearance that Dean used to be in front of him. Sure enough, once he gained the upper hand, the heart of a villain would be exposed. But how many gentlemen would be able to endure again and again after gaining the upper hand? Embark was resentful, but he endured. He had realized that provoking Dean at the moment would only bring disgrace to himself. If he was angry then, it would be tantamount to doing as Dean wished and arouse dissatisfaction from others. At the moment, it would make everyone feel disgusted with Dean's attitude. Sometimes not being angry was more lethal than being angry. There was a trace of surprise in Dean's heart when he saw that Mo Granong didn't make a sound. But he soon thought of the others' thoughts. He glanced at the dissatisfied eyes of others. He knew that Mo Granong had succeeded. His face was calm. He no longer wasted his thoughts on this episode. He continued to think about the previous thoughts and fell into contemplation. The best way is to tell them that the invaders haven't left yet, so they can prepare a trap and gather everyone. Then, I'll use Old Seven's life to force them to jump out and fight with them. This will cause more casualties to the invaders, but it'll be difficult to explain this to them. They might even suspect that I'm colluding with the invaders. Now is a sensitive time, and the moment they suspect me, it'll be very disadvantageous for me. People's hearts were complicated. Simple things often couldn't be said in a simple way. Dudian saw that Yulita, Dragon Mother and others had divided the pursuit team. They had marked the route and map of the pursuit as well as the main search scope and so on. The plan was drawn up quickly and they chose to pursue and search. Dean sighed in his heart. He had to open his mouth. Everyone, I think we can do one thing before trying to pursue and search. He took the initiative to speak. Many people immediately looked over. Eureka frowned and asked, "What is it?" Time was of the essence. She was annoyed to hear even one more word of nonsense. As far as I know, these invaders are not temporary mercenaries. The relationship and friendship between them is not a simple cooperative relationship. They can be called as partners. Dean said. How do you know? So what if you know? Moglen said as he saw Dean take the initiative to jump out. Dean knew that the relationship between the invaders wasn't shallow. He judged it from the way they addressed each other in the temple. He looked at Yulita. They supported each other in life and death situations. They should have a deep friendship with each other. Several of their brothers were killed by you. At the same time, their mission was to take away our goddess Sylvia. Now that the mission has been completed, they can return at any time. But will they really leave? I don't think it's possible for me or anyone else here to do so. Upon hearing this, Yulita was stunned for a moment before her eyes lit up. Dragon Mother pondered for a short while, then loosened her brows and slightly nodded. The middle-aged man with a hooked nose looked at Dudian. The dissatisfaction in his eyes faded. Indeed, when we were besieging them in the Pagel Mountains, I heard them talking about Big Brother and Third Sister. Their relationship isn't shallow. If it was me, I would have found a safe place to hide the god's corpse and then come back to kill them. That's right. Eureka nodded, her eyes filled with excitement. She wasn't stupid, and she knew that the possibility of this was very high. It should be known that the enemy had been able to hide here for a month and figure out the location of the Immortal's corpse. Most likely, the enemy had also figured out the strength of the experts within the wall. Moreover, they didn't have a sovereign realm master overseeing this place. If the enemy knew about this, there was no reason for them not to come back. If that's the case, it's indeed too risky for us to pursue and capture them recklessly. Instead of that, why don't we think of a way to lure them into attacking us first? Eureka quickly thought of a way to set up an ambush. Dean saw that she didn't need to say anything, so he continued to think about his own things. Moglen didn't say anything as he saw that Dudien's proposal was favored by Eureka and the Witcher family. He didn't even look at Dudian. There was no need to continue to test the attitude of the Dragon Clan and Her Highness towards Dudian. Half an hour later, the meeting ended. The torrential rain outside the hall slowly subsided. Mr. Dean, you came in a hurry so your clothes are wet. Be careful when you go back. Eureka took the initiative to send Dean off. She handed him a green animal skin umbrella. It was very delicate and sturdy. It was as waterproof as tarpaulin. It exuded a faint fragrance. Dean took the umbrella. Send someone to inform me if there's anything. I will, Eureka said with a smile. I hope the plan goes smoothly. Dean said a word of blessing and turned away. Eureka's eyes flashed as she looked at Dean's back. She was under a lot of pressure before, but Dean's reminder made her come up with a plan. She was a bit curious about Dean. If it wasn't for this unusual time, she would have sent people to check the details of Dean. She always felt that it was incredible that such a person could be born in such a barren place like the outer wall. I hope it goes well. Otherwise, I have to take the risk to chase and capture them, she muttered to herself. Dean returned to Utopia Mountain. Now Eureka and the others had made a plan. They were just waiting for the intruders to take the bait. But after a month of lurking and stealing the god's corpse, Dean felt that the intruders were completely different from before. The previous intruders were reckless, but this time they were cautious and thoughtful. He knew that the enemy had put away their contempt and wouldn't easily fall into the trap of Eureka and the others. It seems that the next step is to push, Dean pondered in his heart. However, the invaders did not leave any contact information, so he had no way to find them. Because of this, the invaders dared to delay and only took action after lurking for a month. The first thing they did was to seize the god's corpse instead of killing for Dean. They probably expected that Dean would not be able to contact them, so they did not dare to rashly kill the hostage. It was like a kidnapper who kidnapped someone but couldn't contact the family of the hostage. In this case, the kidnapper wouldn't easily kill the hostage. Dean guessed that most of the intruders were interrupted. Even if he wanted to use this to threaten them, he wouldn't be able to do it. After all, he couldn't find the hostage. Similarly, he didn't dare to kill the hostage. After all, if the hostage died, then the intruders wouldn't be able to kill the hostage for him. In the end, they would have to bear the anger of the intruders. The gains weren't worth the losses. So even though their life was seized, they were still fearless. They lurked for a month and didn't take Dean's transaction seriously. Dean thought for a moment and came up with an idea. He called Noyce and asked him to bring the finger bone of the black-robed teenager. He would gather the military and the nobles loyal to the Holy Church as well as all the forces of the Dark Church for an auction. The name of the auction would be the Seventh Brother. Such a name obviously didn't conform to the general rules of the auction. But this event was held by Dean, so everyone listened to him. Even if it didn't conform to the rules, it would be held smoothly. Moreover, it would spread throughout the entire outer wall. Dean believed that the intruders would leave at least 1 or 2 people in the outer wall to monitor his movements. They would also thoroughly investigate his information as well as the hiding place of the seventh brother. Even though the seventh brother was already dead. Soon, the news of the auction organized by the nobles and the big shots spread to thousands of households. In less than half a day, except for the suburbs and small villages, almost all the residents in the other places knew about it. 3 figures appeared on Crow Mountain less than half a day after the auction started. The leader was a stooped old man who was accompanied by a graceful woman and a burly man. As for the other 3 people, they weren't there. Dean's heart moved. The other 3 had stayed to guard the god's corpse. It showed that the location of the god's corpse wasn't outside the outer wall. It shouldn't be far from here. It shouldn't be more than half a day's journey. Brat, what did you do to the seventh brother? The burly man took the lead and rushed into the hall. He stared at Dean with anger written all over his face. Dudian calmly said, "Please sit down." The burly man trembled in anger. The stooped old man sat on the chair next to Dean. "I've seen the finger bone of the seventh brother. What do you mean? Do you want to break the contract?" "It's you who broke the contract," Dean said in a cold voice. "Have you done what I asked you to do after disappearing for a month? Are the masters of the inner wall still alive?" The hunchbacked elder said indifferently, "Killing so many experts isn't an easy task. Furthermore, I don't know if they have a sovereign like me overseeing things. Naturally, I'll have to investigate first. Furthermore, we didn't set a time limit to kill them all. How can that be considered breaking the agreement? But you. I'm wondering whether the seventh brother is dead or alive. You must let us see him. There's no need to talk about meeting him, Dean said in a cold voice. If you want to see him, then we will perish together. I'll kill the hostage, and you will wait for the wall's master to come back and clean you up. The stooped old man slightly raised his eyebrows. He didn't expect Dean's reaction to be so intense. He suppressed his anger. I'll give you 3 more days to kill them all. Dean estimated the time that Eureka and the others would have to bear. In fact, the longer they delay the invaders, the better it would be for him. But he was afraid that Eureka and the others wouldn't be able to wait. Their mentality would explode. 3 days? Isn't it too short? The stooped old man frowned. At most 3 days. Dean's tone was firm. There was no room for discussion. The stooped old man stared at him and said indifferently, "When this matter is resolved, I hope you can let me see a living 7th brother, otherwise, time is of the essence." "Hurry up." Dean interrupted the old man's threat. The hunchbacked old man snorted coldly and got up to leave. Just as he reached the door, he suddenly thought of something and said without turning his head, "Next time you want to find us, go to a hotel in the West End called Audiobook." "What? I've bought the hotel." "All right." Dean knew that Eureka's movements in the inner wall would soon reach their ears after the 3 of them left. Once the war breaks out, he would be the fisherman who reaps the benefits. Such a lucky thing was planned by him. If there was a slight mistake in the process, then he would die. But now things were in his control. The next thing to consider was whether the masters of the inner wall could resist the attack of the dominator level. "Master, what should we do next?" "Let's sleep and rest," Dean said. After several consecutive days of work, he was already very tired. Before the upcoming battle, he had to adjust his condition. 2 days later, on a cloudy afternoon, a loud sound exploded in the capital of the inner wall. All the residents in Royal City heard this deafening sound. It was like an earthquake. When the explosion occurred, countless troops seemed to be on standby. They surged out from all the streets, like rivers flowing into the sea, and rushed to the same place. The residents of the city were scared as they didn't know what was going on. Dean, who was in the outer wall, got the news that there were 2 changes in the city. The first one was a secret report from his intelligence network, and the second one was a request for reinforcements from the royal family. He immediately put on his armor and called Noise. "The battle has begun. Prepare according to what I said before." "I know, master." Noise's expression was solemn. He knew that this was the battle that would determine the fate of the city. Dean rushed to the inner wall alone after he finished his task. A few hours later, when he flew outside Royal City, he immediately saw a large number of soldiers gathered on the streets of the city from afar. The residents had all been sent back to their respective houses, and in the sky above the city center, a few figures were fighting fiercely like sparrows. "They are in a deadlock?" Dean was surprised and happy to see this scene. The time difference between the intelligence and the time he rushed over was enough to determine the outcome of the battle. But he didn't expect that when he arrived, the battle was still going on. It was not a one-sided situation like he had imagined. Chapter 775. A few minutes later, Dean came to the central area of King City. He stopped on the roof of a building. He saw a few ferocious figures fighting in the air. One of them was obviously a bat. His demonized body had a pair of huge bat-like wings. There were white spiral patterns on his body. He looked like a highly poisonous snake. The other one had short wings and a body like a mouse. His head was long and pointed. His whole body was covered with shiny black hair. He couldn't see his facial features. Obviously, one of them was a member of the Winged Demon clan and the other one was an invader. On the other side of the sky, the 2 were fighting fiercely. The heat was like the sun hanging in the sky. It was incomparably dazzling. Their demonized bodies were even more terrifying. One of the demonized bodies was a dragon. Dean recognized that it was a female. It should be the mother of the Dragon clan's patriarch, Dragon Mother. Her body was more ferocious and huge than Aisha's. Her dragon wings covered the sky. Her whole body was covered with black and red scales. Her body looked like it was burning with flames. From time to time, she would spit out flames. The scene looked very bizarre and detached from reality. However, Dean had come into contact with some monsters that could spit fire and acid. Some mutated creatures could produce high concentrations of fat or phosphorus in their bodies. They could bring fire, corrosion, and other abilities. For these creatures, spitting fire was as simple as spitting saliva for humans. The one fighting against Dragon Mother was a winged lizard-like monster. It looked a bit like a Western dragon from the old era. It wasn't much different from Dragon Mother's dragon form. However, the color of the scales and the shape of the wings were different. Moreover, the monster's abdomen was high and bulging. Moreover, its head was almost completely demonized. At first glance, it was clearly the head of a monster. There wasn't the slightest human characteristics. Only the skin around the ears and eyes revealed a little human skin color. It's hard to tell who's better? Dean recognized that the lizard-like monster's face contour was similar to that of a stooped old man. He felt incredible when he saw that Dragon Mother didn't fall into a disadvantageous position. Could it be that Dragon Mother had been hiding her strength? In fact, she had already reached the Dominator level. No wonder the battle could last for so long. Dean's mood was complex. He turned to look at the battle on the ground. He saw that the buildings were destroyed. The ground was dripping with blood. There were corpses everywhere. Soldiers and civilians were screaming as they were dying. The three intruders formed a golden triangle pattern to resist the attacks from all sides. Not far from them, there was a body lying on the ground. It was a young man with a destroyed cheek. Dean knew that he was one of the invaders. He looked at the other five. One of them had been sacrificed. However, there were a lot of corpses on the ground, but there was only one intruder. The rest were left by the pioneers and ordinary soldiers of the inner wall. Among these corpses, the most eye-catching were two extremely huge monster corpses. One was a huge python that was tens of meters long. Its whole body was covered with pitch-black scales. In addition to the abdomen, the sides and back were full of sharp thorns. The soft abdomen of a normal snake was covered with hardened scales, which were extremely tough. Dean recognized that it wasn't a monster that was given a name, but an extremely terrifying monster called Titan Viper. The thorns on its body were filled with venom. Being pricked was no less than being bitten. Looking at its body size, it was at least level 90. It was comparable to the masters of the inner desolate level. If it was a legendary monster with a level of 90, then its combat power would be even more terrifying. It was several times stronger than a non-named monster. The other monster looked like a giant ape, but there were several 10-meter-long bone spikes protruding from its back. At this moment, it was lying on the ground, a large pool of blood under its body. It was also a non-named monster, but its level was over 100, and its combat strength was terrifying. Dean knew that it should be a monster that had been tamed by the Monster Research Institute. It was impossible for the intruder to bring such a huge monster to the central area of King's City. However, the two monsters were dead. Only one intruder was sacrificed. It showed that Dragon Mother didn't use her full strength. It was likely that the one who killed the monster was the master of the intruder. Dragon Mother didn't show any strength to contend against the master when the coffin was taken away. Either she knew that the coffin was fake or she didn't have the ability to display such strength at that time. I really can't underestimate these monster families. Dean's eyes flashed. He surveyed his surroundings. Among the corpses on the ground, he quickly found the rock demon from the meeting in the royal palace. This previous chief of the rock tribe was already dead. His chest had been pierced through, and no one had the time to retrieve his corpse. Without the rock demon, there were no inner desolate level masters in the rock family. Dean frowned. The rock demon was a master of the same generation as Dragon Mother. Now it seemed that the rock demon was much weaker than Dragon Mother. At this time, Dean heard a shout. He turned around and saw the only daughter of the Wall Lord, Princess Yulita, was commanding the army and pioneers to attack the 3 intruders on the ground. She looked anxious. It seemed that she wanted to get rid of the 3 intruders so that she could support Dragon Mother and Wing family in the sky. However, among the 3 intruders, the fat one was like a human-shaped monster. Not only did he have a powerful attack force, but he also had extraordinary endurance. No matter how the surrounding pioneers attacked him, he would always rush up to block them at the first moment. It seemed that these pioneers had suffered losses before. They didn't dare to be knocked down by him. The encirclement was in a stalemate. It seems that we can't be united in the face of a disaster. Seeing this, Dean showed a trace of indifference in his eyes. It was easy for an outsider to see that these pioneers who were encircling the intruders didn't have the murderous spirit to face death. If they rushed forward fearlessly, the 3 intruders wouldn't be able to resist no matter how strong they were. After all, they were outnumbered. Moreover, there were 2 marshals from the military and 3 inner desolate level masters from the monastery. There was no reason that they couldn't kill the 3 intruders. However, judging from the way they fought, it was a bit like dragonflies skimming the water. They didn't dare to confront them head-on. Among them, the most courageous ones were the pioneers in the armor of the military. They obeyed Yulita's orders completely. On the other hand, the pioneers of the 3 families of witches and the monastery seemed to be a bit dispirited. When Dean was observing the details of the surroundings, a whistling sound came from the sky. Bang! Dean saw a black shadow falling diagonally and smashing on the ground, destroying a broken building. In the dust, the black shadow rushed out again. It was Dragon Mother. Chapter 776. Dean's eyelids twitched. He was ready to retreat at any time. The reason why he dared to come close to watch the battle was that the battle would last for several hours. Most of the time it would be a stalemate and both sides wouldn't have time to take care of him. But at the moment Dragon Mother was suppressed. It seemed that she was going to lose. If the battle ended in a short period of time, then it would be dangerous for him to stay here. Dragon Mother! Eureka's face changed as she saw Dragon Mother being shot down. She knew that the key to the outcome of the battle was Dragon Mother. She would lose if she lost. The hunchbacked old man swooped down into the cloud of dust. Boom! Boom! The ground shook violently. At the same time, a figure wrapped in dust flew out at an extremely high speed, passing through 7 to 8 buildings. The solid buildings were easily penetrated like pieces of foam paper. Half of a demonic dragon's wings stretched out from the broken building, trembling as it slowly climbed up. It was Dragon Mother. Her wings flapped and the gravel and dust on her body were blown away. Dean noticed that the faint red light emitted from her scales had weakened. It seemed that only dark scales were left. Moreover, the heat in her body seemed to continue to decline. It had fallen to a level slightly higher than other inner barren level powerhouses. Dean's eyes lit up. It seemed that Dragon Mother had used a secret method to temporarily increase her strength. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that a secret method that could temporarily increase one's strength was a treasure. It seemed that if his plan went smoothly and he controlled the inner wall, he would have to thoroughly investigate the secret methods of the dragon family. Although he would have to pay a high price for such a secret method, but it could turn defeat into victory at the critical moment. At this moment, the hunchbacked old man approached Dragon Mother at an incredible speed, not giving her any chance to catch her breath. Dragon Mother retreated step by step, and the battle soon turned into a one-sided suppression. The hunchbacked old man seemed to be full of energy. The longer he fought, the braver he became, while the weaker Dragon Mother became. More and more wounds appeared on her body. After a few minutes, the old man's claws reached out and grabbed Dragon Mother's wings. He twisted and broke them. Dragon Mother frowned in pain. She held the dragon's sword in her hands and stabbed towards the old man. Her moves were exquisite. However, the old man's movements were fast. He released the broken wings and used his claws to hit her wrist. He bypassed the sword and cut her palms. The sword in one of her hands fell to the ground. Dragon Mother took the opportunity to retreat. However, the old man closed in on her. Dean had a strange feeling in his heart when he saw Dragon Mother couldn't turn back. He felt relieved, but also pitiful, and sighed. He didn't know why these feelings appeared. Perhaps it was because of her struggling look. It was easy to sympathize with her. After all, human beings were contradictory creatures. It seemed to be an instinct to sympathize with the weak. However, this instinct would eventually be replaced by reason. Seeing that Dragon Mother was in danger, the other pioneers on the land became anxious at once. They attacked Fatty and the graceful woman more fiercely and impatiently. However, impatience inevitably led to carelessness. Although Fatty and the other two experienced a great increase of pressure, the pioneers who attacked fiercely were killed one after another. Eureka's face turned ugly. She jumped down from the tower. Black liquid gushed out of her body and entered the demonic body. She also joined the battle. Dean noticed the battlefield from the corner of his eyes. When he saw Eureka's demonic body, his eyes narrowed. Eureka's demonic body was a bit eye-catching. It was not hideous or ugly. On the contrary, it was extremely simplified. Most of her body was still in the shape of a human. She had white skin and long legs, but her hands and feet had turned into sharp claws. A serpent-like tail grew out of the armor on her buttocks. A pair of hairy ears grew out of her hair. In addition, her abdomen and thighs were not demonic. They were still in the shape of a human. However, she was extremely fast. In a blink of an eye, she was in front of Fatty and the others. From the heat source, Dean could see that the heat fluctuation in her body was maintained at the peak of the pioneer level in the outer wasteland. However, every time she attacked, the heat burst out like an explosion, instantly reaching the inner wasteland level. It could be seen that she had an extremely precise control over her power. This fighting ability was not inferior to the commander of the military, maybe even stronger. Moreover, her demonic body was not completely demonic. Generally speaking, the more the demonic body was covered, the higher the degree of demonic transformation and the stronger the power. The demonic transformation of an inner wasteland-level powerhouse was more than 80% of the body. Except for the head, all the parts were demonic. As for the ruler, like the stooped old man, even half of his head was demonic. Unless he deliberately controlled the degree of demonic transformation, it would be the same. Since Eureka was participating in the battle, she naturally attacked with all her strength. However, even with all her strength, her body only had such a small amount of demonic transformation. It was really strange. The strangest thing was that Dean had never seen such a shape of demonic transformation. Among the high-level magic marks that he knew, there seemed to be no such shape. With the addition of Eureka, the pressure on Fatty and the other two increased sharply. Soon, the graceful woman, who had the weakest combat power, had her arm injured by Eureka's claws. The other pioneers found a gap and concentrated their attacks on the graceful woman. The stable golden triangle of the three quickly revealed a flaw. It was only a matter of time before it was broken. Dean was secretly awestruck when he saw Eureka's agile and flickering body. He knew from the intelligence that Eureka was not very old, even 2 years younger than him. However, the power she showed at this moment was much stronger than him. It was estimated that she could compete with Haisha. However, it was not surprising. Her father was the Wall Lord, so he had all the resources. Dean suspected that her magic marks were not from the monsters near the giant wall, but from other places, even from the kingdom of God. It was estimated that it was also a legendary magic mark, or even a higher-level magic mark. Just as Eureka led the pioneers of all forces to attack, the situation on the other side suddenly changed dramatically. Most of Dean's attention was still on Dragon Mother's battle. She was unable to resist the attack of the stooped old man. She was forced into the battle circle, and the injuries on her body were increasing. Just when Dean thought that the battle would end in 5 minutes, Dragon Mother suddenly burst out an amazing aura and forced the stooped old man to retreat. The stooped old man didn't seem to expect that she still had such a strong power. After being repelled, he coughed up a mouthful of blood and looked at her in shock. Chapter 777. The heat on Dragon Mother's body was fading at an amazing speed. At the same time, the pitch-black scales outside her body gradually turned into white crystals, emitting a white mist. The transformation happened very fast. From her chest as the center, the mist spread to every corner of her body. Within a blink of an eye, even the enormous dragon wings on her back had turned into a pair of crystal wings that looked like 2 ice sculptures. Ice crystal? Dean was shocked. It looked like his frozen right arm. Did Dragon Mother also have ice blood disease? Moreover, she seemed to be able to control her body to transform into ice crystals? The stooped old man roared angrily when he saw Dragon Mother's transformation. He suddenly raised his speed, trying to interrupt her transformation. However, Dragon Mother's body had been mostly crystallized by now, and the heat inside her had dropped to the freezing point. She looked like a dying person. She let out a sonorous phoenix cry and lunged at the old man. Her demonized ice crystal dragon claw tore out forcefully, even leaving cracks in the air. White mist coiled around her body as the dragon claw struck on the old man's sharp claw. In the next moment, the old man retracted his claw as fast as a bolt of lightning. His claw was wrapped in a frosty mist, showing signs of being frozen. The stooped old man's face darkened. He immediately retreated. Dragon Mother took advantage of the victory and chased after him. She forced the old man to retreat step by step. The old man didn't dare to fight back, so he could only hide. Dean's eyelids twitched. He didn't expect that the situation would be reversed in an instant. Dragon Mother's power could even force a dominator to retreat. During the chase, the area of Dragon Mother's body grew larger and larger. Soon, her entire body was covered in ice, making her look like a goddess of war carved from ice and snow. Meanwhile, the heat released from her body had completely disappeared. Even when she launched fierce attacks, she didn't release any heat at all. Dean watched the two of them chase as fast as lightning. Their roles were switched in the blink of an eye. He was surprised. Was there such a hidden power in the ice blood disease? How did she control it? After his right arm was crystallized, no matter how hard he tried to control it, his right arm was always crystallized, and couldn't return to normal human skin. However, during the meeting, he didn't see any sign of ice blood disease on Dragon Mother's body, which made him doubt that Dragon Mother didn't have ice blood disease. However, her crystallized body was so real, exactly like his right arm. However, she didn't show this power until now. There should be a big sequela, Dudian thought. At this moment, Dragon Mother's combat power was slightly higher than the Dominator. She was one of the stronger ones among the Dominators. Her power was completely above the other 2 hunter families. The Rock Demon, as the strongest of the Rock family, had died in battle, which meant that he didn't have the same power as Dragon Mother. On the other side, the strongest of the Wing family was the same. They only had the power of the inner wilderness, but they weren't the top of the inner wilderness. Dragon Mother was on another level. If she could control this power freely, the Rock tribe and the Wing tribe would never have existed. This could only mean that this power would bring great sequela to her, and she couldn't use it at any time. She might have to pay a big price after using it once. It would save me a lot of trouble if she could directly kill these invaders. After she killed them, she would also fall into a period of weakness. Then the rest of the people. Thinking of the rest of the people, Dudian couldn't help but look at the battlefield where Eureka and the others were fighting. He saw Eureka leading the pioneers to besiege Fatty and the other two invaders. The graceful woman was the most seriously injured. Her chest was stabbed and there was a blood stain. Fatty, who had been unscathed all this while, was now covered in wounds. There were several purple and black patches on his skin, as if he had been poisoned. His movements were no longer as agile as before, and he had no time to take care of the graceful woman. The strongest of the Wing family, Eureka, and the two military masters. There are 4 inner wilderness powerhouses, and the rest of the pioneers and outer wilderness powerhouses there are 17-18 people. Dudien's eyes swept around, observing the situation on the battlefield. If Dragon Mother could kill the invaders, then it would be the weakest period of the inner wall. If Dragon Mother recovered, he would have almost no hope to occupy the inner wall. After all, the hidden power of Dragon Mother had really scared him, and it was far beyond his expectation. Therefore, he had to take action when the battle was over. He couldn't give them time to recover. However, from the current situation, even with Aisha's help, it would be difficult to deal with so many pioneers. Dean didn't care about those ordinary pioneers. Even if there were twice as many ordinary pioneers, he wouldn't put them in his eyes. No one could withstand his sharp attack, and they would die in a single touch. But the 4 inner wilderness powerhouses were a bit tricky. With Aisha's strength, she could only contain one of them. Moreover, these people were not stupid. Once they fought, they would be aware of Aisha's special situation. They could let one of them delay Aisha, and the other 3 could kill Dudien. Although Aisha's current strength belonged to the top level of the inner wilderness, but she lost in awareness. It was very difficult to deal with an inner wilderness level powerhouse in a short period of time. Dean didn't want to let Aisha take action as much as possible. In the current situation, there were only 4 inner wilderness level powerhouses left. It was meaningless to let Aisha deal with one of them. With his current strength, it was too difficult to deal with the masters of the inner wall. It was almost impossible. But once he missed this opportunity, it would be even more difficult to let Dragon Mother recover. Moreover, he didn't know when the Wall Lord, who was at the level of Abyss Walker, would return. Once he appeared, Dudien could only slip away to live in the wilderness outside the giant wall. He didn't dare to step half a step near the giant wall. Therefore, there was only one opportunity in front of him. Dudien was thinking while paying attention to the movements on both sides of the battlefield. The hunchbacked old man was being chased by Dragon Mother. His body was torn by Dragon Mother's claws. Some parts of his body were frostbitten, and his blood vessels were sealed. The defeat was almost irreversible. Dudien saw that the old man didn't make any move. He knew that the old man didn't have any cards up his sleeves. This meant that Dragon Mother would win. A trace of ruthlessness flashed in his eyes. He no longer hesitated as he rushed into the battlefield. He used the demonic body and turned into a terrifying monster with sharp blades all over his body. He rushed towards the battlefield where Eureka was. Eureka noticed the amazing aura coming from behind. She turned her head and recognized that the monster was Dudien. There was a trace of surprise in her eyes. She recognized Dudien's demonic body. The National Master also had such a demonic body. She didn't expect that Dudien, a resident of the Outer Wall, could get the magic marks of the legendary monster Splitter. Moreover, there seemed to be some differences between Dudien's demonic body and the National Master's, but she couldn't tell what the differences were. It seemed that the number of sharp blades on his body was more, and the luster of each part of the shell was slightly different. "Where's Haisha?" Eureka withdrew from the battle and retreated to the outer edge. She anxiously asked Dudien, who was approaching at high speed. Dean rushed to her and stopped, saying, "She'll be here soon. I'll support her first." "Not good." His pupils suddenly shrank as he looked at the front of Eureka in horror. Eureka's heart skipped a beat. She quickly turned around and saw that the battle in the encirclement was still going on. The three invaders had not broken free from the encirclement of the outstanding pioneers. Suddenly, an ominous feeling rose in her heart. Before she could turn around, a murderous aura suddenly burst out from behind her. Eureka turned her head in horror. She saw Dudien's fair and handsome cheeks were full of dense killing intent. The sharp blades on his body were attacking her head, chest, and other fatal parts. Puff! A cutting sound rang out. Blood sputtered. Eureka's body flew upside down. After flying a few rounds in the air, she landed on one foot. Her body crawled on the ground like a civet. Her eyes were red as she stared at Dudien angrily. There was a scratch on her neck. It was shallow, but it had already cut her carotid artery. There were also a few bloody holes on her chest, arms, shoulders, and other places, but there were no fatal injuries. She raised her hand to cover the carotid artery, pressing down the flowing blood. She gritted her teeth, and her eyes were full of hatred. How could she not understand that Dudien had betrayed them? At this critical moment, he actually attacked her and helped the invaders. This kind of betrayal made her particularly angry. She couldn't wait to tear Dudien into pieces with her eyes. Dudien's heart sank when he saw that she had escaped the fatal attack. He secretly regretted it. At the same time, he also felt a trace of fear. He had seen Eureka's quick reaction before, but he didn't expect her nerve reaction speed to be so fast. In such a short moment, she could actually escape his sneak attack at such a close distance. It was simply terrifying. If it was a head-on fight, even if he was full of sharp weapons, it was estimated that it would be difficult to hurt her even a little bit. He didn't continue to chase Eureka. Instead, he immediately changed his direction and rushed to the encirclement of the three invaders. The surrounding pioneers were focused on attacking the three invaders. When they saw Dudien coming over, they didn't think much. However, when Dudien approached them, they immediately attacked. In the blink of an eye, several pioneers were caught off guard and were injured by the sneak attack. 2 of them were beheaded on the spot and died. When Fatty saw Dudien, he thought that Dudien had come to help these people to encircle and annihilate them. His eyes showed anger. However, the next moment, when he saw Dudien's attack, he was stunned for a moment. He quickly reacted and immediately moved closer to Dudien. Inform your boss to retreat immediately. I've left a trap under the wall of size leading to the outer wall. It can help you cover your retreat. Dudien joined the encirclement of the 3 people and repelled the surrounding pioneers. At the same time, he whispered quickly, "Leave immediately. That dragon mother has used a special method to enhance her strength, but it should only be maintained for a very short time. After this period, it won't be too late to kill back." Hearing Dudien's words, Fatty raised his head and glanced at the distance. When he saw Dragon Mother's whole body had turned into ice, his face changed. "Gather at my territory. I'll go first. You guys hurry up." Dudien didn't wait for his reply. He killed his way out of the encirclement and fled all the way to the distance. Seeing Dudien escape, Eureka gritted her teeth and shouted to the pioneers who were chasing Dudien, "Don't worry about him. Kill them first." The pioneers heard her words and stopped immediately. They turned back to continue to encircle Fatty and the others. Eureka also joined the battle. She was angry and annoyed. The reason why she didn't send people to chase Dudien was that Aisha was behind him. Moreover, Dudien's strength was not inferior to the god of war at the peak of the outer wasteland. If they wanted to chase Dudien, they would have to send at least 2 inner wasteland-level powerhouses. Otherwise, they would die. Once they sent people to chase Dudien, it would be easy for the 3 invaders to escape. She was worried that Dudien deliberately lured her to chase him and contain their strength so that the invaders could escape. In a blink of an eye, Dudien rushed out 7 or 8 miles away. He jumped onto a roof and stopped. Seeing that no one was chasing him, he was relieved. Then he looked at the battle in front of him. He believed that the invaders should have a way to break out of the encirclement. Once they caught up with him, he could act according to his plan. A few minutes later, as Dudian expected, Fatty passed the news to the stooped old man. The stooped old man pinned down Dragon Mother. Fatty suddenly broke out and tore a gap in the encirclement. He took the other two people to kill them. However, halfway through the fight, Eureka and the others saw through their intentions and attacked with all their might. The graceful woman was killed on the spot, her head separated from her body. Fatty was sad and angry. He didn't irrationally take revenge for the graceful woman. Instead, he took the other person to kill them out of the encirclement and fled in the direction of Dudian. Dudian immediately turned around and ran. He couldn't wait for them to catch up, especially the stooped old man. Once he brought Dragon Mother, no matter who it was, they could easily catch up with him and kill him. Dudian used the magic wings and rushed forward. In the blink of an eye, he rushed out of King's City and flew into the wilderness. After flying at full speed for more than an hour, Dudian arrived at the Sighing Wall. At this moment, there were 7 or 8 frontiersmen patrolling the Sighing Wall. They immediately issued a warning when they saw Dudian flying over. Dudian landed and quickly killed all the guards on the wall. He took out a signal tube that was commonly used by hunters outside the giant wall. He held it in his hand. He was a little nervous as he waited quietly. After a moment, several shadows appeared in the distant sky and rapidly approached. They were the intruders led by the stooped old man. However, there were only 3 of them. The 5th brother who was fighting with the Wing family powerhouse was gone. There were only the stooped old man, the burly man, and Fatty. All 3 of them had injuries and the smell of blood on their bodies. They were quite embarrassed. Dudian's eyes flashed. When they got close he shouted, "Are there any pursuers?" The stooped old man panted slightly. His eyes were deep. He looked at Dudian and said in a low voice, "They are not far behind. Has the person who fought with you caught up?" Dudian continued to ask. "No." The stooped old man's answer was very brief. Dean looked behind them. At the end of the horizon in the wasteland, he could vaguely see some black spots approaching. He looked up and said to the 3 people who were flying over, "Go to my territory first, heal your wounds, and then come back." The stooped old man did not speak. He nodded and flew over the Sighing Wall. Dudian flew behind them. After flying for thousands of meters, he opened the signal tube in his hand and a red smoke bomb rushed into the sky. The stooped old man turned his head. His eyes flashed with murderous intent. He said coldly, "What is this?" "Signal flare." Dudian seemed to say without hesitation, "I said, I will cover them. They are catching up. My people will delay them when they pass through here. They should be able to stop some of them. As for the rest, you should be able to easily deal with them with your strength. They won't dare to chase too deep." The Dragon Mother did not catch up, but the others did. Dudian estimated that Yulita and the others were very anxious at this moment. In their eyes, this was the only chance to kill the intruders and take back the god's corpse, but it was ruined by him. The stooped old man stared at Dudian. He did not say much. He adjusted his breathing and tried to recover as much as possible while rushing on. Just when they were about to reach Mount Utopia, an earth-shaking roar came from afar. It was as if a mountain had fallen from the sky and smashed on the ground. The rumbling sound caused the ground to shake, and the aftermath spread dozens of miles away. Chapter 778. The hunchbacked old man's heart skipped a beat when he heard the loud explosion. He turned around and saw a huge cloud of dust rising from the Wall of Sighs. The cloud of dust rose several hundred meters high in the blink of an eye, and could be seen even from dozens of miles away. The 3 of them didn't expect Dean to set such a dangerous trap. Fortunately, he didn't use it against them. There was a trace of coldness in their eyes as they looked at Dean. He mercilessly attacked the people inside the wall and helped them. It could be seen that this person was not an ordinary person. In the blink of an eye, Dean, the old man and others flew over Utopo Mountain. Dean took the lead to land. He glanced around but didn't see Noyce and others. He was relieved as he quietly walked into the temple. The attendants of light who were stationed outside the temple saluted respectfully as they saw Dean. They looked towards the direction of the sighing wall after Dean entered the temple. They could faintly hear the huge explosion. It was hard to imagine what had happened. Stooped Old Man and others followed Dean into the temple. Stooped Old Man's heart was relieved. He knew that the master of the devil family didn't chase them. There were only some ordinary pioneers and masters of the inner wilderness. The strength of the trap left by Dean was enough to make them suffer. Even if they caught up, he could deal with it. He immediately found a chair and sat down after entering the temple. He took out the healing medicines from his backpack and didn't talk to Dean. The burly man and Fatty looked at Dean. They wanted to say something, but they held back. They could guess that Dean spared no effort to help them because he was worried that they would die. No one would kill the masters of the inner wall for him. Both sides were taking advantage of each other. Hurry up and heal. We'll go back as soon as your injuries are healed. We can't delay or the next attack will be more difficult, Dean said to the three of them. Stooped Old Man's lips slightly moved. He wanted to say something but soon stopped. He closed his eyes and focused on healing his injuries. Fatty saw his reaction and immediately understood his thoughts. He didn't talk to Dean but took out the healing medicines for himself. Dean's eyes flashed as he saw that the three of them were in a hurry to heal. He sat on the throne and put his palm on the armrest. His fingertips touched the groove on the inside of the armrest and gently pressed it. A slight cracking sound echoed throughout the temple. The sound was so soft that even a hunter might not be able to hear it. However, the hunchbacked old man and his two companions had keen hearing. They immediately sensed the abnormality and raised their heads to look around. In the next moment, a pitch-black hole appeared on the pillars, walls, and ground of the divine temple. Water arrows shot out from the hole and into the hall below the stairs. The three of them's face changed. Although they didn't know the reason, they knew that it wasn't a good thing. Just as the three of them were ready to get up and hide, their bodies suddenly froze. They stood or sat in the same place as if they were stunned. The stooped old man was stunned for a moment before his eyes widened in anger. He abruptly stood up from his chair, and a pair of demonic wings sprouted from his back. He floated in the air, his eyes filled with anger and killing intent as he turned to look at the throne. When he looked back, he saw Dean sitting on the throne sinking. You trash, get ready to die. Your seventh brother has been killed by me. Do you want to go back? Obediently die. Dean changed his previous reserved appearance and looked at stooped old man contemptuously. Stooped old man's pupils shrank as he heard Dean's words. He was so angry that his eyes almost burst out. It was obvious that they were deceived by Dean. The most important thing was that the seventh brother who was responsible for the return trip was dead. No wonder he saw the seventh brother's finger in the second auction. He was puzzled at that time, but he didn't dare to think about it. Now it seemed that the seventh brother was obviously dead. Dean just used the seventh brother's body to pretend that the seventh brother was in his hands. He wanted to take advantage of them. Ah! The stooped old man roared as he rushed towards Dean. Go to! He hadn't finished the last word when a fire instantly spread throughout the temple. It was as if a hole had been pierced in the sky. The monstrous flames and thick smoke instantly submerged everything. If one looked down from the sky, they would see that the sacred Utopia mountain had exploded at this moment. Wu Tuo Mountain, which was more than 400 meters tall, exploded like a volcano. The destructive explosion produced a deafening boom. The streets more than 10 kilometers away from the divine mountain were swept up by the violent wind generated by the explosion. The pedestrians on the streets were instantly blown away, and some of the fluttering merchant flags were even snapped in half. Countless tiny stones and metal shards shot out. Some pedestrians on the streets were shot through the head or body by the stones. The destructive heat wave spread out, sweeping up the thick fog and dust into every street. With the entire holy mountain as the center, it was as if a magnitude 12 earthquake had occurred. The ground rumbled and the dust was like a beast tide that engulfed everything. This explosion happened in an instant. At the moment of the explosion, the entire Wu Tuo mountain was instantly destroyed. Like a delicate porcelain suddenly shattering, the mountain was blown into ashes. The destructive power of doomsday spread out. The Knights of Light who were patrolling the mountain as usual did not even have the time to react. In an instant they were engulfed by the explosion, their bodies shattered and evaporated. The aftershock of the explosion spread quickly. It was more than 10 times more violent than the explosion of the Wall of Sighs. At this moment, people in all areas of the commercial district felt the ground shaking and trembling. They also heard the angry explosion coming from the distance. Everyone stopped what they were doing and looked up in the direction of the sound source in amazement. In an office of the military headquarters, the teacup on Richelieu's table fell down. The tea soaked the documents he had just processed, but his eyes were staring blankly at the direction of Utopia Mountain outside the window. The corner of his mouth was slightly trembling. With a swoosh, a large number of stones were ejected from the explosion of the divine mountain. Among them, a pitch-black oval-shaped object flew out along with the stones. After flying for 200 to 300 meters horizontally from the top of the divine temple that was hundreds of meters high, it fell on the ground in a parabolic trajectory and hit a castle. It penetrated the castle and landed in the courtyard of the castle. It rolled over a dozen times before stopping, black smoke rising from it. This was not a stone, but an elliptical metal ball 5 or 6 meters high. But at this moment the metal ball was broken at one end. Chapter 779. With a clang, a sharp claw suddenly extended from the edge of the crack. Immediately after, a terrifying shadow with sharp blades all over its body emerged from within, scaring the curious hound into whining and running away. The ferocious figure was Dean. He slowly crawled out of the metal ball. He couldn't help but cough every time he crawled out. Blood splashed on the ground. He grimaced in pain. It took a lot of effort to drag his body out. He turned over and lay on the ground, gasping for breath. Drowsiness overcame him, forcing him to keep his eyes open. After resting for a moment, he crawled up from the ground, his body swaying. A few sharp blades on his back had broken off and stabbed into his body, causing quite a bit of injury. The biggest wound was caused by a piece of metal on his chest, which had pierced through his demonized armor and stuck in his ribs, bleeding non-stop. Fortunately, he had entered the metal ball and displayed his demonic body. Otherwise, this piece of metal would not just be stuck in his ribs, it would have pierced through his chest and killed him on the spot. He took a light breath to relieve the burning pain on his body. He looked up at the direction of the explosion in the distance. There was a trace of palpitation in his eyes. He didn't expect the destructive power of the explosion to be so terrifying. When he activated the explosive device, he had already sunk into the protective cabin. The protective cabin was made of tungsten steel and was incomparably tough. However, it was penetrated by the shock wave of the explosion. The aftershock almost took half of his life. It must be known that he had used his demonic body to protect himself. If he hadn't felt it, he couldn't imagine what would have happened to him. He thought of the old man and the other two. At the last moment, except for the old man who broke away from the electric current, the fat man and the other burly man seemed to be in a state of paralysis. It was almost impossible to make a protective response in that state. Even if they woke up in time, it would be difficult to react. Moreover, the power of the gunpowder explosion in Mount Wu Tuo had exceeded his expectations. He had thought that it would be good if it could seriously injure the three of them, but judging from the current situation, the three of them had less than a 10% chance of surviving. He had deliberately exposed the death of the black-robed young man to the hunchbacked old man in order to infuriate him and make him chase him. Then, he would lead the old man to the second base. There were twice as many wind and solar power stations and more than 3 times as many explosives as here. There was a great chance that he could blow up the hunchbacked old man, but judging from the current situation, it was most likely not necessary. Now that he thought about it, he still felt a burst of fear. After all, he was not an explosives expert. His estimation of explosives was not so accurate, especially such a large amount of explosives. Even a professional explosives expert might not be able to estimate how much damage it would cause. After all, there were no advanced instruments from the old era that could evaluate specific detailed data. If there were more explosives in Mount Wutuo, or if he had not prepared the tungsten steel protective cabin, he would probably have died in the explosion and perished together with the 3 intruders. Fortunately, such a mistake did not happen. Otherwise, he would really want to cry but have no tears. Looking at the gradually subsiding explosion in the distance, Dean exhaled lightly and slowly stood up. His muscles immediately affected the metal plate on his chest. He slightly bared his teeth and made up his mind. The demonization of his body was lifted and he returned to his human appearance. He raised his hand to cover the huge metal plate stuck in his chest and pulled it out. Puff! A violent tearing pain almost made him cry out in pain. Fortunately, the violent pain was only temporary. He gritted his teeth and used the dragon blood technique to control the flow of blood in his body. He stopped the bleeding in his chest. He felt as if his chest was being burned by fire and the pain was unbearable. However, he had experienced this degree of pain many times. He took a few deep breaths and let himself adapt. He dragged his feet in the direction of Mount Wutuo. His pupils entered the state of X-ray vision, searching for the figures of the 3 intruders. Although the power of the explosion was enough to kill them, he could not relax until he saw their bodies. The explosion came very abruptly and ended very quickly as well. The gunpowder burned out in an instant and the curtains fell on the ground. Wutuo Mountain was no longer a tall mountain, only thick smoke and dust that rose up like a tall mountain. Inside the smoke, there was a faint blood-red flame that looked terrifying. Dean walked to the original square in front of the mountain. His eyes penetrated the thick fog and immediately saw the destructive traces brought by the terrifying explosion. The area more than 100 meters around Mount Wutuo was completely sunken. Whether it was the square or the castle-like buildings, they were all razed to the ground. The street more than 200 meters away was also a mess. The road was full of gravel and thick dust, and there were passers-by screaming on the ground. Dean's scalp tingled. Although he was only standing on the ground at the moment, a picture emerged in his mind. The entire Mount Wutuo had completely disappeared. The ground at the foot of the mountain had collapsed into a huge crater. Burning smoke was emitted from the soil. The land had experienced the baptism of explosives and became incomparably black, like human skin that had been burned. Except for this big crater, there was nothing left here. Many buildings on the mountain, the temple, the laboratory, the monument of the goddess and so on were all gone. It seemed that they had never existed. For the first time, Dean witnessed such a terrible destruction. The first thought in his mind was that the world had started nuclear weapons in the old era. Black gunpowder alone had such a terrible effect. No wonder there was no peace in the world after the nuclear explosion. Just like the ruins outside the giant wall, the nuclear radiation in the air was still silently invading the bodies of the survivors after more than 300 years. He took a deep breath and looked around. The old man and the other 2 were likely to be blown away and fell in a place far away. He stimulated his magic wings and rushed into the thick smoke and black fog. He squinted his eyes and searched around. At the same time, he was vigilant of the surroundings, guarding against possible sneak attacks at any time. 4 or 5 minutes later, Dean found a figure on the west side of Mount Wu-Tua. The heat source concentration was limited. He immediately rushed over and saw the figure lying in the ruins of a building that had been smashed by gravel. It was the old man. At the moment, the old man seemed to have fainted. His body was covered with scars, large and small gravel and metal pieces were embedded in his body. In addition, one of his legs was blown off. His hair was burnt black and fluffy. Dean's heart relaxed. His eyes were slightly bright. There was an unexpected feeling of surprise. He took out the dagger that he carried with him and slammed it toward the old man's throat. Ding! The dagger stabbed into the old man's throat, but was blocked by the demonized scales on his neck. Chapter 780. At this moment, Dean was extremely nervous. He was worried that the old man would pretend to be unconscious and deliberately lure him closer. But he had to make a move. There was only one chance. If the old man really fainted, then his caution would be stupid. Whoosh! Dean's sharp limbs instantly approached the old man, all pointing at the weak parts of the old man's body. Dean's heart was in his throat. The next moment, the sharp limbs all hit the old man. But the old man's fine scales were extremely tough, beyond Dean's imagination. They were far harder than steel. The old man's sharp limbs barely pierced into the old man's body, but failed to penetrate. At this time, the old man seemed to be stimulated by the pain. He groaned and opened his eyes. Seeing the old man open his eyelids, Dean's heartbeat almost stopped. The gap in strength between the two made him feel the crisis of death instantly. His brain was hot. He roared and madly waved all the sharp limbs to stab out. Die! He roared. The sickle-like limbs turned into countless afterimages, madly shooting out. The speed was so fast that it was only a phantom. He didn't know how long the attack lasted. When Dean felt a sense of extreme weakness in his heart, he slowly woke up. The fast-waving sharp limbs also slowly stopped. He looked at the old man in front of him, but saw that the old man's body was broken. There was no sound and his death was tragic. There were bloody holes in the old man's throat, chest, head and other fatal parts. Especially the neck, it was almost completely broken, leaving only a trace of blood hanging. Dean couldn't help but lift a few sharp limbs to stab the old man's body along the wound. He lifted the old man's body and repeatedly looked at it several times. Finally, he was sure that the old man was dead. His heartbeat had stopped. Through X-ray, he could see that the old man's heart was cut into a small piece, and the spine in the neck was cut off. He was dead. The ruler of the giant wall was dead. He died in front of him. Dean had an unreal feeling. All of this seemed to be much easier and smoother than he had expected. The second base that he had prepared as the next trap was completely useless. He breathed heavily, and only after a long time had passed did he slowly regain his calmness. With a wave of his arm, the stooped elder's head was completely cut off. Then, he carried the elder's head and soared into the air, flying above the ruins of the explosion. He looked around, searching for the remaining two intruders' figures. Even though there were no other high-level heat being released at the scene, he couldn't rule out the possibility that they were hiding their heat. If he was alive, he wanted to see him. If he was dead, he wanted to see his corpse. Otherwise, his heart would not be at peace. Half an hour later, Dean finally found the bodies of the other two intruders. Half of the fat man's head and one of the arms of the burly man. There was also a magic hunting tool. Dean flew back to the old man's broken headless body. Now he was basically sure that all three intruders died here. It was inconceivable that the intruders who were a headache to the inner wall had died in his hands. However, he had mobilized almost all the resources of the outer wall in order to prepare for this day. He had filled the mountain with more than 1,000 tons of gunpowder. He had spent a lot of manpower on mining and production. In addition, he had lured the intruders here so that they would be defenseless. It was a crucial step. Any mistake in this step could lead to a different situation. His purpose of detonating the wall was to make the three of them relax their vigilance in addition to blocking the pursuit of the inner wall. It must be known that the impact of intentional and unintentional resistance were two completely different levels. He heaved a sigh of relief and felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. His physical strength seemed to have been completely overdrawn. He sat on the ground to rest and recover. At the same time, he took out another signal tube from his bag and pulled it open. A green smoke bomb immediately rose into the sky. After a moment, the sound of horses' hooves echoed. Noyce led a team of Knights of Light. Noyce and the Knights of Light were aghast as they saw the ruins surround Dudian. If it wasn't for the outline of the surrounding buildings, they wouldn't dare to imagine that this huge pit was Utopo Mountain, which was full of holy flowers. Noyce ran over as he saw Dean's pale face. "Master, how are you? Are the invaders all dead?" "Dead," Dean panted. "Send people to block this place and find the pieces of their bodies. Also send someone to bring Aisha. I'm going to the inner wall." Noyce was relieved as he heard that the intruders were dead. He knew that the main purpose of the plan was to kill the intruders, but he didn't expect that it would be over before Dean could finish the last step of the plan. He looked at the terrible wound on Dean's chest. He took out the healing and antidotes from his bag and handed them to Dean. "The intruders have been dealt with. Why do you still want to go to the inner wall? Why don't you wait for your injuries to heal first?" Dean took the medicine and said, "The master of the inner wall is seriously injured. I have to kill her before she recovers. Otherwise it will be difficult to find such an opportunity in the future. If I don't come back, then it's likely that I won't be able to come back. Let Sergei and the others leave the Holy Church and live incognito." Noyce's heart throbbed as he listened to Dean's last words. "Master, don't be discouraged. You will definitely come back. You are the only person who has escaped from Thornflower Prison for hundreds of years. What is this little difficulty?" Dean smiled bitterly. The escape from Thornflower Prison was nothing to him. But it seemed that it left a deep impression in Noyce's heart. Dean sighed. He thought that if he had more pioneers to help him, then his chances of survival would be much higher. Unfortunately, he could only fight alone. Aisha was the only one who could accompany him. Noyce saw the bitterness in Dean's eyes. He wanted to say something, but he held back. He knew that it was useless to encourage Dean at this moment. But it seemed that it left a deep impression in Noyce's heart. He thought that if he had more pioneers to help him, then his chances of survival would be much higher. Unfortunately, he could only fight alone. Aisha was the only one who could accompany him. Dean patted Noyce's shoulder. "Don't worry. Aisha will accompany me. Nothing will happen. Go and bring her here. I'll heal first." "I know." Noyce took a deep breath and nodded. He turned around and ordered a group of Knights of Light to guard Dean. "Dragon Mother hasn't chased after us. Most of the sequelae have flared up and she needs to recuperate. Otherwise she wouldn't miss this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I hope that the dragon family doesn't have any medicine that can restore her combat effectiveness. Otherwise it will be a disaster." Dean sat on the ground. A young Knight of Light put a stone on his back to lean on. Dean looked at the young knight and thanked him. He used dragon blood technique to speed up the recovery of his injuries. At the same time, he was thinking about the chances of going to the inner wall. The young knight knew that Dean was a big shot. He was flattered and stayed with the other Knights of Light to guard Dean. Dean's injuries were almost healed after 2 hours. Noyce sent Aisha to Dean. Dean's last order to Aisha was to stay in place. But in her mind there was no such thing as stay in place. She just needed to keep her body stiff. That's why she could be transported to the second base by Noyce and from the second base to here. Dean got up and took Aisha's hand. He took a deep look at her face and whispered, "This time it's very likely that you will have to make a move. It's a great opportunity. You won't be angry, right? Aisha was silent. Dean held her hand and looked at Noyce. I'm going. I'll leave the matters here to you. Noyce was worried. Be careful. He didn't use honorifics, but his words were more sincere than ever. Dean looked at him and nodded. I will. He flew towards the inner wall with Aisha in his arms. Flying high up in the sky, he could see everything on the ground more clearly. He saw that Mount Wu Tuo had disappeared, and in its place was a huge, charred crater. In the surrounding 7 to 8 miles of streets, there were faintly visible earthquake-like cracks, and the aftermath of the explosion spread very far. Dean saw a lot of civilians gathering in the direction of Wu Tuo Mountain. He was afraid that there would be no more Wu Tuo Mountain from now on. He liked this mountain in his heart. Perhaps it was because of the difference between its name and the word utopia in the old era. But both were symbols of beauty. When he flew to the wall, Dudian suddenly saw a shocking scene. The wall that had been erected for more than 200 years had a huge hole in it. The edge of the hole was somewhat black, and there was a faint smell of blood and gunpowder near the hole. In addition, there were some soldiers stationed here, including 2 pioneers. The reason why Dean dared to pass through here was that he didn't see any pursuers during the more than 2 hours of recuperation. So he inferred that the pursuers should be injured by the explosion and didn't dare to continue to pursue. At the moment there were only 2 pioneers, and they seemed to be ordinary pioneers. Dean didn't hesitate and immediately swooped down. The 2 pioneers also saw Dean flying in the sky. Their faces suddenly changed. They hurriedly ordered the patrolling soldiers to send out a signal flare. Dean quickly landed and put Aisha on the wall. Then he stimulated the demon body and rushed towards the 2 pioneers. The 2 pioneers didn't dare to hold back. They stimulated the demon body at the first time. The young pioneer was the Black Weaver. After stimulating the demon body, she immediately drilled into the rock. The other one was like a porcupine. His whole body was covered with steel thorns. His hands turned into claws. He crawled on the ground and fled quickly. Dean flapped his wings and instantly accelerated to catch up with him. The sharp blade on his back suddenly stabbed out. Puff, puff. The blade easily penetrated the pioneer's body like piercing tofu. With a swing of the strange limb, the pioneer's body was instantly halved. Blood and intestines flowed everywhere. He was directly killed. After several battles with pioneers, Dean's current combat experience was different from the past. Ordinary pioneers were not his opponent. Although these ordinary pioneers had fought far more than Dean, their combat skills were not necessarily better than his. Some people had fought 10 times and gained more experience than those who had fought hundreds of times. This kind of people were usually called geniuses, and Dean was such a genius. Moreover, the abnormal part of the Splitter's magic mark was its terrible cutting power. There were few opponents of the same level, not to mention that Dean's physique was a grade higher than the opponent's. Whoosh! Dean turned around and flew back to Aisha, hugged her body and continued to fly forward, ignoring the Blackweave magic mark pioneer who had burrowed into the ground. Entering the inner wall area, he flew over the wilderness and went straight to the dragon family's territory. After about 2 hours, Dean finally came to the dragon family's territory. Unlike the rock family, the dragon family did not build their territory in the cities, but in the suburbs outside the 2 cities, connecting the 2 cities. The dragon family lived in the mountains, surrounded by peaks. If one walked in, it was very easy to get lost. Who are you? Stop. In front of the mountain gate, 8 dragon family guards on duty shouted at Dean. Dean's eyes flashed coldly. He suddenly accelerated and swooped down toward them. Seeing Dean approaching at high speed, the 8 people's faces changed. There was a trace of panic in some of their eyes. They saw Dean's terrible strength, but they did not dare to escape because of their duty. All of them pulled out their weapons and rushed to Dean. Puff, 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 puff. Dean's figure flew straight, almost without a pause. Behind him, a blood mist exploded. The bodies of the 8 Lemiter guards were broken, and they died on the spot. This is the family you have been guarding. I haven't seen you for a short time, but you can't even recognize me. Dean held Aisha and flew up the stairs, his eyes cold. They all deserve to die. Aisha was held in Dean's arms like a princess. She was silent, but her pure black eyes seemed to flash slightly. Dean quickly flew to the hillside. There was a large building, the style of which was a bit like the ancient houses of the East. It was built with wood and had a unique charm. At this moment, the guards stationed in the hillside square saw Dean and immediately shouted angrily. Chapter 781. Dean turned a blind eye to the constant gathering of guards on the hillside square. He descended from the sky with Aisha in his arms. His magic wings retracted behind his back, and the terrifying sharp blades on his body fell to the ground, leaving a groove on the floor. He put Aisha down, took her hand and whispered, "You will see your father later. I will ask him why he indulges Haley so much. Is his blood as cold as my hands?" Aisha was silent and let him lead her. Dean looked up and stepped forward, looking down on everything. "Stop! Who dares to break into my dragon family's territory? Go forward and kill him." The guards gathered in front of Dean, blocking his way, and said with a ruthless look. Some of the guards saw Dean holding Aisha's hand, and their eyes showed a surprised and uncertain look. At the moment, Aisha's face was covered with a veil, but this thin layer of veil couldn't hide her beautiful appearance. Her clothes and temperament made them think of a person. Seeing that Dean didn't stop, several guards finally couldn't bear it. They roared, waved their weapons, and rushed toward Dean. Puff, puff. Several guards rushed toward Dean, but their bodies suddenly froze in place, and their faces were full of disbelief. Dean's eyes were indifferent as he held Aisha's hand and walked straight ahead. Several guards barely turned their eyes and stared at Dean in horror. The next moment, a lot of blood spurted out from their necks and chests. The impact of the blood broke their bodies and split them into a pile of body parts. Then they fell to the ground. Other guards saw such a strange scene, and the anger on their faces suddenly disappeared. Their faces were full of horror, and they kept retreating. Dean walked from the gate of the hillside to the square, and the guards also retreated from the gate to the square. Whoosh! A figure rushed out from the hall behind the square, and landed in front of the guards with a few leaps. It was a handsome young man. When he saw Dean's terrifying demonic body, his face slightly changed. Obviously, Dean's physique was at the pioneer level, and he had never seen such a demonic body shape before. It should be a rare legendary monster. The next moment, his eyes noticed Dean holding Aisha's hand, and he suddenly froze in place. Dean's footsteps didn't stop, and he was still moving forward step by step. It seemed that nothing could stop his pace. Feeling the amazing murderous aura, the handsome young man recovered and couldn't help but shout to Aisha, "Your Highness, you're finally back. We heard that you had an accident in the wasteland. It's great to see you back. Who is this?" He still had a lot to say, but seeing Dean's murderous aura, he had to open his mouth. Aisha naturally wouldn't answer him. Dean replaced Aisha's mouth, and his voice was very cold. "Get out of here if you don't want to die. Let the patriarch and dragon mother come out to see me, or your dragon clan will die." The handsome young man was stunned. He didn't expect Dean's tone to be so arrogant, and he was accompanied by Aisha. He couldn't believe it. How could Aisha be with such a person? But seeing that Aisha didn't respond, he already knew what she meant. His face quickly sank. "It's impossible to see the patriarch and dragon mother. Your Highness, you can't let this person mess around. He has killed our clansmen, and if he continues, he will become the #1 wanted target of our dragon clan. Kill him." Dean's eyes flashed coldly, and he no longer said anything. He let go of Aisha's hand and let her stand in place. The next moment, his figure suddenly rushed out, like a black phantom, and swept towards the handsome young man. The handsome young man's pupils shrank as he said in horror, "You dare!" His words stopped abruptly as his head flew high. Dean's sharp limbs trembled slightly as the head was about to hit the ground, and split the head into two halves. He stepped over it and turned back to Aisha. He took her hand and continued to move forward. The handsome young man probably didn't expect that only two people would dare to kill in the dragon clan. Moreover, one of them was Aisha. All the dragons knew that Aisha had sheltered the dragon clan many times. He didn't expect Dean to attack because of Aisha's presence. Otherwise he wouldn't dare to let Dean get close to him even if he was careless. Whoosh! Whoosh! On the distant hillside, two figures flew fast, one in front and one behind. At the same time, there was a rustling sound from the foot of the hill, and the sound of robes fluttering in the wind. Dean's pupils expanded to the maximum, and he saw blazing figures coming from all directions. All of them were pioneer-level masters, and many of them were at the peak of the outer wilderness. So far, there was no inner wilderness master. He was secretly relieved. When he watched Yulita gather all the forces to besiege the invaders in the Pagil Mountains, he noticed that there were only 7 inner wilderness masters. In the battle in King City, not long ago, Dragon Mother was the only one who was an inner Baron level master of the dragon tribe. Those who had reached the inner Baron level were basically the leaders of all forces. He had predicted the worst, that there would at most be one inner Baron level master in the dragon tribe's territory. But now it seemed that there was not even one. "You once said that you don't have any friends. I'm the only friend you can talk to." Dean looked at the approaching pioneers with bloodthirsty killing intent in his eyes. He whispered to Aisha, "Even if there are your friends among them, they deserve to die." Aisha was indifferent and didn't respond. At this time, pioneers from all directions arrived one after another. Dean released Aisha's palm and aimed at the pioneers who arrived first. His figure moved and suddenly jumped out, trying to kill as many as possible before all the pioneers gathered. The first to arrive was an old man in his 60s. He was thin, but his movements were extremely fast. He was shocked and angry when he saw the pools of blood on the square, the pieces of corpses on the ground, and the headless corpses. He roared and rushed toward Dean. However, Dean happened to rush towards him. Feeling Dean's amazing killing intent, the anger in Miff's heart was like cold water poured on his head. He sobered up in an instant. As an older pioneer who had participated in more than 5 hunting operations in the wasteland, the intuition brought by his combat experience told him that Dean in front of him was extremely dangerous and not someone he could match. He immediately braked, stimulated the demon body, and turned to run. The scene looked rather comical, and the guards who were waiting for reinforcements were dumbfounded. Whoosh! Dean's magic wings flapped, and the blade-like limbs on his back stretched in a strange posture. If there was a wind magic master here, he would find that each of Dean's blade-like limbs had a strange streamline, which could greatly reduce air resistance and even accelerate with the help of wind. This was the reason why the blade-like limbs' attack speed was beyond that of ordinary pioneers of the same rank. Dean was like a wild beast with its own propeller. In the blink of an eye, he caught up with Miff, and his arms quickly stretched out. Miff felt the terrible killing intent coming from his back. He turned around in horror, and the 2 new demonized arms under his armpits hurriedly grabbed. These arms were made of demonization, and when the demon body was removed, they would disappear. On the contrary, no matter how serious the injuries were, they would recover when the demon body was stimulated again. Therefore, in this instant, his first reaction was to block Dean's attack with the help of the demonized arms. Puff, puff, puff. 3 cutting sounds sounded almost at the same time, like a sharp knife cutting 3 pieces of cloth. The 2 demonized arms were cut off by Dean's scythe without any hindrance, and directly pierced into his back. Dean turned his arms, and blood spurted out. Miff's heart was instantly broken, and his eyes were panic-stricken. He fell to the ground and rolled several times. After killing this person, Dean did not stop. His eyes had already locked on the second target. He slightly turned his body, changed direction, and rushed to the second person. In the blink of an eye, he was in front of this person. This person's reaction was the same as Miff's, from anger to panic. When he wanted to escape, it was too late, and Dean quickly caught up and beheaded him. These pioneers' magic marks were good at speed, but they still couldn't escape from Dean. The horror of legendary magic marks was that even if they were the ultimate attack-type splitters, their speed and perception were not inferior to ordinary rare magic marks. This could be seen from their transparent pupils, super-range vision, and speed close to that of inner desolate level masters. After Dudian killed 2 people, the other pioneers who heard the news seemed to be aware of the changes here. The next moment they gathered together. Dean aimed at the target and killed halfway. After killing 2 more people, the rest of the pioneers finally gathered together, but the number was only 5. Counting the one killed by Dean, there were a total of 9 people. Dean licked his lips, looking at the 5 pioneers who rushed together. 2 of them had reached the peak heat source of the outer desolate level, but Dean was not afraid. Instead, he felt inexplicably excited. The smell of blood on his body made him have a crazy impulse. Miff! Clancy! The 5 people were shocked, sad, and angry when they saw the 2 bodies falling on the edge of the square. One of the outer desolate level middle-aged man saw Dean, frowned, and whispered, "Be careful, this person should be the intruder. We can't let him go." Although he knew the existence of Dean in the outer wall, he was not interested in it, so he didn't know too much about it. Moreover, there were no photos in this era, only portraits, so he didn't recognize Dean. When the others heard the word intruder, the anger in their eyes suddenly became stronger. One of them roared and took the lead to rush over. Dean also rushed to the 5 people at high speed. It was the most suitable for him to deal with these pioneers in the battle against Dragon Mother. Go! The others roared, stimulated their own demonic bodies, and swarmed toward Dean. Dean's speed didn't decrease, and his blade-like limbs expanded outward like a weird ball full of sharp blades, which made people's scalp tingle. 2 of the 5 pioneers were assassins with weak defense, and they were good at hiding and using poison. At this moment, seeing Dean's ferocious demonic body, they felt a toothache and immediately rushed to the side, not daring to touch him. When Dean rushed out, he paid attention to the expressions of the 5 people, and soon locked on the 2 dodging people as his targets. He knew that often the lack of a certain aspect would be strengthened in another aspect, just like his splitter magic mark, which was good at attacking, but very weak in defense. However, his weak defense was only relative to other legendary magic marks. In terms of pure defense, it was only slightly inferior to the rare steel dragon magic mark. Whoosh! Dean rushed to one of the dodging people. Seeing Dean's speed, this person thought that he would meet the other 3 head-on, but he didn't expect that Dean would suddenly turn to kill him. His heart suddenly turned cold, and he knew that it was not good. He turned around and ran, trying to keep a distance from Dean. He complained in his heart. He couldn't figure out why Dean would attack him from afar. Moreover, he would fall into a situation where he would be attacked from both sides. The gains were not worth the losses. He even suspected that he had inadvertently offended Dean, but in his impression, there was no such person. Go to hell! A knight holding a spear roared and stabbed from behind Dean. The magic spear in his hand was a standard 4-meter-long lance. Although there was no horse, it was still extremely flexible in his hand. After all, his demonic body was nearly 4 meters tall, extremely thin, and his arms were very thin. His body looked soft like rubber, and there was a thin film on his spine like cicada wings. His demonic body was not much different from that of a human, but his skin was as gray as a corpse. However, this didn't mean that his demonic body was incomplete. On the contrary, his original body was less than 2 meters tall, but now it was nearly 4 meters tall. Although the body structure was similar to that of a human, it was also a complete demonic form. This was the form of a ghoul magic mark. Dean's blade-like limbs suddenly popped out and swept to the lance. Two clangs sounded, and the lance was cut off. The knight was stunned for a moment, and his face was aghast. He didn't expect the blade-like limbs to be so terrifying. It was simply cutting iron like mud. If he was a little closer, he estimated that his whole body would be cut into several pieces. How could he fight in close combat? The other two also saw this scene, and their eyes were full of horror. The speed of the pursuit couldn't help but slow down, and they didn't know how to attack. Dean suddenly accelerated, shook off the three people, and quickly caught up with the person in front of him who was running away. No, the screams came to an abrupt end. When Dean's body was 3 meters away from his back, the sharp blade-like limbs flashed and turned into several afterimages. The next moment, Dean's body swept past, leaving a pile of body parts in the same place. Dean quickly turned and killed the other person. Chapter 782. Stop! Just as Dean was about to catch up with her, an angry roar sounded. Dean glanced at the source of the voice, and a cold light flashed in his eyes. The one who spoke was the current patriarch of the Dragon Clan. He was rushing down the steps from the slope. Dean snorted and suddenly accelerated. He quickly got close to the back of the round-faced young woman, and his sharp limbs shot out. The round-faced young woman was shocked, and her eyes were full of despair. She gritted her teeth, and her abdomen suddenly bulged. As Dean approached, she suddenly turned her head and spat out a green mucus. Puff, puff. Dean's sharp limbs easily penetrated her body, as if stabbing into a bubble. But at the same time, the green mucus spat out by the round-faced young woman stained the sharp limbs. Dean felt a corrosive burning sensation from the sharp limbs. His face changed slightly, and he immediately released the demon body. The black fluid condensed into the demon hunter knife, and the green mucus appeared on the knife. When the demon body was released, the demon hunter knife returned to a weapon, and the connection between it and Dean's body was cut off. He looked at the green mucus on the knife and smelled the stench. He immediately tore a piece of clothes from the round-faced young woman in front of him, rolled it into a ball, and wiped off the mucus, trying not to let it touch his body. Although this round-faced young woman was just an ordinary pioneer, a pioneer who was good at using poison couldn't be judged with common sense. Even if it was a poison created by a Lemmeter, if it was injected into a pioneer's blood, it would still be easily killed. He was glad that he used the demonic limbs to block the green mucus. If it fell on his body, even if he didn't die, his fighting strength would be greatly reduced. You! Mudley looked at the body of the round-faced young woman, and his eyes were slightly swollen. He clenched his fists and gritted his teeth. Our Dragon Clan has no enmity with you. Even if we caught you before, it was because Aisha privately taught you the secret technique, which violated the rules. You owe us a favor. Not only did we not kill you, but we also gave you resources to improve your strength. How could you bite the hand that feeds you? Dean looked at him, and then glanced at the other 3 people who were chasing him. He faintly smiled with a bit of ridicule. So, the Patriarch knows about me. I didn't expect you to remember that little person. Since you came out, I want to ask you something. Aisha and Hathaway are your daughters. Don't you know what kind of character they are? What do you mean? Mudley's face was gloomy. How could Aisha steal the secret technique? Her character is very easy to understand. It's impossible that you don't know about it. Dean's voice was cold. You also know that Hathaway has been jealous of her sister for so many years. This is clearly a trap. It's ridiculous that you know about it but still stick to the rules and punish Aisha. She was born with awakening ability. She was cultivated as a saint since childhood. How much has she done for the family? Hasn't she fought to protect your family every day of her life? But what about you? How did you treat her? Mudley's expression changed slightly. He said in a deep voice, "This is her mission. If her sister had her talent, she would have received the same mission from a young age. This is the tradition of our dragon clan, and it is the same for other witch clans. This is not for you to criticize. Don't you think I would feel heartache for my own daughter? If you really feel heartache, then abolish the tradition for your daughter." Dean's eyes were cold. "What qualifications do you have to be the patriarch if you can't protect your own daughter? What qualifications do you have to be her father? Even when she was in the wasteland, I didn't see your dragon clan grieve for her. Did anyone grieve for her? Did anyone go to the wasteland to look for her body? No." Dean's eyes were like a knife as he stared at Mudley. "She is like a tool. When she is broken, she loses all her value and is abandoned by you. Is this the tradition of your family? It's true that you can prosper forever, but if this is the only way to maintain your prosperity, then what's the point of having this prosperity?" Mudley angrily said, "What do you know? Do you think it's as simple as you think? Do you know how many members there are in a family? Do you think you can do whatever you want? Wasteland is dangerous. She is dead. If we send people to look for her, then the loss will be even greater. Losing her is already a heavy price that we can't accept. If we lose more people because of this, it will only bring about more negative effect." Dean was startled as he heard Mudley's words. He almost couldn't believe his ears. Such cold-blooded and selfish words could come out from the mouth of a father. He suddenly felt heartache and sadness. He felt heartache because Aisha had sheltered such a group of people from childhood to adulthood. He felt sad because the latter was telling him such words in an angry tone. Mistakes weren't terrible. What was terrible was that it wasn't a mistake in his cognition. This kind of thinking was the most difficult thing to change, even if he killed him. Dean was silent for a moment. He slowly said, "You can't afford to lose such a powerful fighting force. But you didn't see the love and loyalty behind this power. That is the most precious thing in the world, isn't it?" Mudley coldly said, "Of course I know. I don't need you to tell me. I can understand the thoughts of a superior." Dean said to himself, "The environment of a superior is very different from that of an ordinary person. Their first reaction is biased towards the perspective of interest, so they are used to thinking from the perspective of interests. However, thinking too much makes people utilitarian. When a person stares at one thing for a long time, he will slowly ignore other things. You are a qualified superior but not an excellent one, because understanding people's hearts is the most important thing. Countless emperors have fallen because of this." Mudley's face was gloomy. "What do you want to do here? Avenge her? Do you think Hathaway killed her? It means that you have a clear idea in your heart. It seems that you are also a person who deserves to die." Dean slightly raised his eyes and indifferently looked at him. "I wanted to spare your life because you are her father. But since you have a clear idea in your heart, you let her be killed in such an inexplicable way. But you didn't help her get justice. A father like you is not worthy." Mudley sullenly said, "They are my daughters. Although I have a guess, but this matter is unclear. Did you see with your own eyes that Hathaway framed her sister? Even so, I have lost a daughter. Do you want me to lose another one?" Chapter 783. Mudley's face slightly changed as he clenched his fists. "You dared to come here because you saw the battle between Dragon Mother and the invaders. You despicable villain. You didn't help the invaders when they invaded the giant wall. Don't you know that the people here will be plunged into misery and suffering? Do you think you can use them to strengthen yourself? They will kill you when no one in the inner wall can stop them." Dean was sure that Dragon Mother was recuperating at the moment as he saw Mudley's reaction. He calmed down. "So many masters have gathered here to visit Dragon Mother. I also want to visit her. Show me the way." "Bastard! Do you think you are qualified to see Dragon Mother? A handsome youth shouted in anger. Mudray said coldly, Do you think that you can trespass the territory of my dragon tribe just because the Dragon Mother is injured? If it wasn't for the fact that the intruder's whereabouts are unknown and the Dragon Mother is in charge, she would have come out and killed you long ago. It seemed that Dragon Mother was seriously overdrawn after using the ice blood disease. If she was forced to take action herself, then he would have to let Aisha fight against her. He wouldn't be able to fight against an inner Baron-level powerhouse even if the latter was in a wounded state. He stared at Mudley's angry eyes and didn't show any weakness. You said so much because you are worried that I will let her take action. It seems that you know something about me. In that case, let me see Dragon Mother before I go on a killing spree. Mudley looked at him. You said that I am not worthy to be her father. What are you then? Although I don't know how you infected her and turned her into a corpse queen, but I advise you to free her. My daughter is not a tool for you to fight. Dean's face turned gloomy. I have never treated her as a tool for fighting. Mudley snorted. As far as I know, when Haley took people to kill you in the outer wall, it was because of her that you survived, right? You are just an outer-level pioneer. Even if you have the legendary magic mark of the splitter, it is impossible for you to defeat Haley. Moreover, you have the magic scorpion god and the elder of the monastery with you. Do you dare to say that you didn't treat her as a tool? You brought her here because you are worried that you can't get out of here. So you let her take charge of the battle for you. Dean stared at him for a moment. I let her fight for me, but my purpose is different from yours. I believe that she will take the initiative to fight for me even if she is conscious. But you let her guard the wasteland outside the giant wall day and night. This is not what she wants. But she has to do this for the family and the overall situation in your eyes because she is your daughter. You even think that she should do this because she is a saintess. But none of you ever asked her if she was willing to be the saintess, and if this was what she was pursuing. Mudley's face slightly changed. Of course I know that she doesn't want to be a saintess. She sneaked out when she was a child but ran in the wrong direction and went to the outer wall. But why is she able to endure for so many years? How many people in this world can spend their whole life doing what they like and pursuing what they like? If she were here, do you think she would help you? This is the person she wanted to protect with all her might when she was alive. She can't refuse because her heart is too kind. If you don't exist, then she won't have so much pain. Even if there is pain, it will only be temporary. Dean's eyes were indifferent. I can give you a chance to live if you don't follow my path. I just want to get the highest power in the inner wall and use it to investigate the way to restore her. If there is no way to restore her consciousness, then go to the kingdom of God. I will restore her consciousness in my lifetime, even if I have to destroy all of you. Anyone who tries to stop me will die. You're crazy. Mudley looked at him in anger. How can a corpse restore consciousness? This is something that has never been heard for hundreds of years. Even the kingdom of God can't do it. You have killed so many people, but it is in vain. If killing people isn't enough, then kill the god. Dean's eyes were full of anger. You haven't been to the kingdom of God, so how do you know that it doesn't exist? Even if the kingdom of God doesn't exist, I will plunder the high-level resources of the world to create a way to restore her. I will bring her back from hell even if she is dead. Mudley stared at him blankly. After a long time, he said, No matter what, don't even think about leaving this place today. You hurt my clansmen, and I will spare your life to pay for it. As for her, I will set her free after you die. She definitely doesn't want to see herself living like this. After all, this is what she hates the most. What do you know about freedom? Dean could not help but be furious. He suddenly made a move. His sharp limbs danced like a terrifying blade. His body suddenly swooped forward, but the moment he took 2 steps, he suddenly turned around and attacked in the opposite direction. The other 3 instinctively chased after Dean to stop him, but they were caught off guard by Dean's sudden attack. One of them was shocked as Dean instantly closed in on him. Puff, puff, puff. The man didn't have time to react as his body was cut into several pieces. His demonized body was covered with armor and looked extremely hard, but he was still killed in an instant. Seeing this scene, Mudley was furious. He roared and quickly demonized his body. His magic mark was the same as Haisha's, the Dragon Warrior's magic mark. It was ranked in front of Splitter among the legendary monsters. It had extraordinary defense and terrifying attack power. It was a rare magic mark with both offensive and defensive capabilities. Although its attack was slightly inferior to Splitter's, its defense was much better than Splitter's magic mark. Moreover, its flying speed was much faster than Splitter's. Except that it couldn't enter the ground, it was extremely strong in air and land battles. Moreover, it could spit high-fat dragon breath, which was the nemesis of many magic marks. He demonized into a dragon and roared. His feet turned into dragon claws and stepped on the ground, leaving cracks on the floor. He rushed at Dean at high speed. Dean felt the blazing energy behind him and had to turn back to attack. His sharp limbs gathered into a huge sharp spine and stabbed at Mudley's chest. You're tuning into the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.